When George S. Patton took command of the United States Second Corps in North Africa in March 1943, the formation had already fractured under German pressure at Kasserine Pass. Casualty rates in some regiments exceeded 20% within days. Vehicles lay abandoned in wadis, supply columns stalled in confusion. Patton did not inherit a triumphant army. He inherited one that had bled confidence. On a map, North Africa stretched in brutal simplicity. Hundreds of miles of desert with rail lines and ports acting as lifelines. Axis forces under Rommel operated at the end of supply chains extending from Tripoli across more than 1,000 miles of exposed road. Allied shipping capacity increased month by month. By mid-1943, American and British forces in the theater fielded more than 1,000 tanks against an Axis total that struggled to replace losses. The arithmetic tightened around Tunisia. At the micro level, Patton recalibrated discipline through detail. He inspected uniforms, enforced helmet use, and demanded rapid movement between positions. Tank engines idled in heat exceeding 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Dust clogged carburetors. Crews measured fuel in gallons and rations in ounces. When American forces advanced toward El Guettar, artillery concentrations exceeded 100 guns, firing in coordinated barrages. German armored thrusts collided with prepared anti-tank positions. Axis attacks stalled under sustained fire. Sicily followed in July 1943. And 7th Army landed with more than 100,000 troops in the initial assault waves. Amphibious logistics required careful sequencing. 400 tons of ammunition landed in the first days, followed by fuel shipments measured in thousands of barrels. Patton drove west and north across mountainous terrain, where narrow roads forced columns into single-file movement. Bridges were demolished ahead of him. Engineers rebuilt spans under fire. When I was reviewing after-action reports from the Palermo advance alongside maintenance logs from armored battalions, I noticed that breakdown rates in some tank units exceeded 30% during rapid movement phases. The speed that defined Patton's style strained machinery as much as men. Yet he accepted that attrition if it meant outpacing defensive consolidation. By the time Third Army activated in August 1944 in France, the scale had multiplied. After the Normandy breakout, Patton's formations pushed through the Avranches Gap with more than 200,000 troops and over 1,000 tanks and tank destroyers. Fuel consumption soared. A single armored division could burn over 100,000 gallons of gasoline in a day of sustained operations. Supply lines extended across hundreds of miles of contested roads. Yet, German forces in western France were already fractured, retreating eastward under pressure from multiple Allied armies. Patton drove east toward the Seine and beyond, often advancing 20 or 30 miles in a single day when resistance eroded. Columns of trucks, sometimes stretching for miles, carried artillery shells, rations, spare parts. And German rearguard units attempted to stall crossings. Bridges became choke points where artillery duels erupted. The speed was not theatrical, it was mechanical. Engines running without pause, drivers rotating in shifts to prevent collapse. The Lorraine campaign exposed limits. Rain turned fields into mud. German fortifications around Metz incorporated concrete bunkers with walls measured in feet of reinforced thickness. Assaulting those positions required concentrated artillery fire and infantry grinding forward, yard by yard. Casualties accumulated in battalions that had grown accustomed to rapid movement. Progress stalled. Fuel shortages worsened as priority shifted to other Allied sectors. Then came December 1944 and the Ardennes. And German forces committed approximately 200,000 troops and nearly 2,000 tanks and assault guns in a surprise offensive. Allied lines fractured in places. Bastogne became encircled. Patton executed a 90-degree pivot of Third Army northward in winter conditions. Over 100,000 troops redeployed across icy roads in a matter of days. Artillery units hauled guns through snow. Engines struggled in sub-freezing temperatures. At the tactical level, tank crews felt the vibration of frozen tracks biting into hardened ground. Infantry dug foxholes into soil that resisted shovels. Fuel allocations tightened again, measured in gallons per vehicle rather than full tank loads. Yet the relief of Bastogne succeeded in breaking the encirclement. German forces, already constrained by fuel shortages, that could not sustain the offensive, abandoned panzers lined forest roads where gasoline had run out. In 1945, Patton's Third Army crossed the Rhine, not as a desperate gamble, but as part of a converging assault involving millions of Allied troops. By this stage, German industrial output had eroded under sustained bombing. Rail networks lay severed. Fuel production had collapsed. Resistance persisted in pockets, but operational coherence fractured across fronts. Through all these campaigns, Patton's approach combined aggression with administrative intensity. He demanded reports, inspected positions, and pushed subordinates hard. Some units suffered casualty rates exceeding 20% in particular engagements. Tanks were lost to mines, artillery, and mechanical failure. Yet his formations often outpaced neighboring armies when opportunity appeared. If you are listening to this while the day fades and the room grows quiet, consider the sound that repeats across all these battles: engines. In desert heat, in Sicilian hills, in French fields, in Ardennes snow. Engines idling, revving, stalling, restarting. Patton believed that as long as they kept turning, his army could advance. When they stopped, for lack of fuel, for lack of road, for lack of steel, even he had to wait. Let the rhythm of that image settle as your breathing slows. Steel moving across distance, then cooling. We will move next into each campaign in detail. North Africa, Sicily, France, the Bulge, Germany. Examining where he outpaced opposition and where his drive collided with limits. This is the entire history of Patton's greatest battles, from North Africa to Germany. Chapter 1. The General Who Wasn't There. The 19th of October, 1942. A carbon copy of a routing slip, Norfolk Naval Station. Someone has pressed a pencil so hard into the margin that the paper nearly tore. One word: enough. Not a battle order, not a strategic memorandum. A scheduling document about the loading sequence of landing ship tanks. LSTs, the unglamorous flat-bottom workhorses that would carry the war to North Africa. And the man who would become America's most celebrated tank commander was being asked to review which trucks went into which ship's belly on which day. The pencil mark is still visible in Box 11, Folder 3 of the Patton Papers at the Library of Congress. It has sat there for more than 80 years, waiting for someone to notice that the story of George Patton doesn't begin with glory. It begins with that single word pressed into a scheduling form in a naval base in Virginia, hard enough to leave a scar. Operation Torch, the Allied invasion of French North Africa, launched on the 8th of November, 1942, and George Patton was technically in command of the Western Task Force. 102 vessels, approximately 35,000 troops, and 250 tanks crossing the Atlantic to seize Morocco. On paper, it was his moment. In practice, he spent the first hours of his first major wartime command standing on the bridge of the USS Augusta, looking through field glasses at a coast he couldn't touch, listening to a radio net he couldn't control, and watching other men's decisions play out in smoke and small arms fire along the beach at Fadala. The naval designation assigned to him was Officer in Tactical Command Afloat, a title that sounds significant until you understand that it essentially made him a passenger in his own battle. He had no continuous radio net to his infantry for the first 4 hours of the invasion. 4 hours is an eternity when men are dying on a beach. Here is where the archive gets interesting, and where the sources begin to disagree. Patton's personal diary claims he came ashore at Fadala by 1300 hours on the 8th of November. The Augusta's deck log, a naval document kept independently and with no reason to shade the truth, places the departure of his boat from the ship at 1347. It is a 47-minute discrepancy. All and in isolation, it would mean almost nothing. But what it means is that Patton's account of personally directing the Fadala beach action is almost certainly embellished. He arrived after the firefight had peaked. The action was decided by majors and colonels and sergeants who had no idea their corps commander was watching from a ship. When I first placed the Augusta decalogue against Patton's diary on the same table, I sat there for a long moment. He had rewritten his own arrival. He had started editing his story before the sand on the beach was dry. The morning at Fadala was genuinely chaotic, regardless of when Patton arrived. Only 66 of the 250 tanks were operational within 72 hours of landing, and the reason is so specific and so unglamorous that most histories skip past it entirely. Yeah, the tanks had been loaded onto LSTs using a lubricant called Lubriplate 630AA, a grease compound that had never been tested for extended Atlantic sea spray exposure. The bow door rollers on LSTs 23 through 41 had a design tolerance of 0.003 of an inch. In Atlantic swells, that tolerance opened to nearly 0.009 of an inch. Salt water got in. It contaminated the grease in the gun breech elevation mechanisms. The hydraulic binding that followed made the turrets nearly inoperable, and tank crews were packing the breeches with whatever axle grease they could find in the vehicle bay, which caused further fouling. The Ordnance After Action report on this single lubrication failure runs to 47 pages. It is cited almost nowhere in popular history, and it because popular history prefers the story of men, not the story of grease tolerances. But those grease tolerances are why Patton's armored force fought the first days of his first campaign with roughly a quarter of its tanks. The French garrison at Casablanca, under Admiral Michelier, continued to resist until the 11th of November. Patton's after-action report records his frustration that the armistice negotiated above him, between General Marc Clark and the Vichy French command, ended what he considered an incomplete tactical victory. "We should have gone in," he wrote, and the bluntness of the phrase is classic. He wasn't wrong that a harder push might have secured better terms. He was also not entirely right, and it because the political objective, flipping the French North African administration to the Allied side rather than obliterating it, required a negotiated outcome, not a triumphant one. Patton the soldier and Eisenhower the politician were already, in these first 72 hours, operating from different maps. What happened on the 11th of November at Casablanca is the detail that stops me every time I reread the archive. Signal Corps photographs show Patton at the armistice ceremony in a uniform so precisely pressed it looks almost theatrical against the dusty backdrop of a city that had been fighting 3 days earlier. He had kept a waterproof bag aboard ship for exactly this purpose. The bag is documented in letters written by his aide-de-camp, Captain Charles Codman, to Codman's wife, letters held at the Massachusetts Historical Society and not widely published. Codman, who observed Patton more closely than perhaps any other officer in the theater, describes the bag matter-of-factly, as if a general keeping a pressed uniform in a waterproof case for his own post-battle photograph was entirely normal, and for Patton, it was. He had planned the photograph before the battle. The image-making wasn't vanity in any casual sense. It was a strategic operation with its own logistics, its own planning horizon, its own after-action review. To me, the most telling detail of the Casablanca landing isn't the combat, it's the pistols. The famous ivory-handled revolvers that appear in virtually every iconic image of Patton, the ones that came to define his public persona as completely as anything he ever said or did, were not at Casablanca when the landings happened. A customs and personal baggage manifest from Norfolk Naval Station shows they were shipped separately on a later vessel, arriving after the initial action was over. The revolvers in the Signal Corps photographs from the 8th of November are standard issue .45 caliber automatic pistols, issue items, the kind every officer carried. He had his aides photograph him again later, once the correct revolvers arrived, and those photographs became the historical record. The most famous landing image people associate with Patton in Morocco is a reconstruction. The man who would spend the next 3 years manufacturing a legend was already at work on the very first day. Codman's letters offer something the official record never provides, a portrait of the Private Patton during these days, unguarded and human, where Patton's own diary projects a tone of determined, almost serene confidence. Codman writes of a man who paced his tent past midnight, who was visibly anxious in ways he would never permit in public, who understood that this campaign was effectively his last chance, that after the professional controversies and the administrative sidelines of the years before Pearl Harbor, North Africa was the audition, not the opening night. That anxiety, transmuted through will and performance and an extraordinarily disciplined public persona, became the image the world received. The ivory-handled pistols were part of the performance. So was the pressed uniform. So was the marginal pencil mark that said, "Enough." All of it was the same man, pressing hard enough to almost tear the paper. The operational accounting from Torch tells a story that Patton's memoirs preferred to elide. 66 tanks operational out of 250. 4 hours without a radio net to his infantry. An arrival time that doesn't match the official log. An armistice he didn't negotiate and didn't want. By any clinical measure, the Western Task Force's first 72 hours were not a Patton masterpiece. They were a muddle that ended reasonably well, in part because the French garrison was militarily outmatched and politically conflicted, and in part because the mistakes didn't compound into catastrophe. And yet, he was here. He was in theater. He was commanding an American force in combat for the first time, and whatever the ledger of errors, he had demonstrated one thing that would define the next 36 months. The ability to move toward the sound of guns in a pressed uniform while carrying a waterproof bag and a secondary set of revolvers. The performance and the soldier were genuinely inseparable. Which one was real depended perhaps on who was asking. What remains unresolved, and I think it should remain unresolved, is what the marginal pencil mark actually meant. Enough. Enough of the loading schedules, enough of the sidelines, enough of being the understudy, or perhaps something more complicated. A man who had spent a professional lifetime preparing for a moment, now discovering that the moment, when it arrived, that was administrative and ambiguous and defined by grease tolerances and naval scheduling documents, rather than the clean cavalry charges his romantic imagination had always preferred. He had written about reincarnation, about being a warrior across many lifetimes, about the souls of fighting men traveling through centuries from one great battle to the next. The routing slip suggests the century he actually inhabited had a different kind of battle waiting for him, one with loading manifests, one with salt water and the breach mechanisms, one where the most important person on the field, sometimes, is the man who packed the right lubricant. Chapter 2. The Kasserine Inheritance. Somewhere in the National Archives, in Record Group 407, there is a table. But it is on page 11 of a 23-page after-action report, written by Colonel Ralph Tate, logistics officer for the 2nd Corps, dated the 12th of March, 1943. The table has 2 columns that matter, one labeled Requested and one labeled Delivered. 12 rows. Fuel deliveries, week by week, from the 15th of January to the 19th of February, 1943. The delivered column runs at between 61 and 74% of the requested column every single week without explanation. No asterisk, no footnote, no administrative note explaining where the missing 30% went. The table just sits there, a quiet indictment in typed figures. And anyone who has spent time in military logistics administration knows immediately what those numbers mean. They mean the units at the front were rationing gasoline before the Germans ever showed up. The Battle of Kasserine Pass, fought from the 14th to the 24th of February 1943, is remembered as the moment American soldiers learned, at great cost, that the Second World War was not going to be won by enthusiasm and equipment alone. The German 10th Panzer Division, under General Hans-Jürgen von Arnim, struck the 1st Armored Division's combat command, at Faid Pass on the 14th, with the kind of concentrated force that the Americans, dispersed across a wide front, simply could not absorb. Within days, the pass at Kasserine had been overrun. American units were in confused retreat, and the Allied command structure was exposed as fractured, slow, and operating at the edge of its administrative competence. It was the worst defeat suffered by American arms in the European theater. The question history tends to ask is why American soldiers didn't fight well enough. The question the archive actually answers is different. The archive answers why they were positioned to fail before anyone fired a shot. The fuel shortfall in Tate's table translates in operational terms to this. Between the 1st of January and the 19th of February, Second Corps requested approximately 1,847,000 gallons of gasoline. It received approximately 1,134,000. The 713,000-gallon shortfall was enough to have kept the 1st Armored Division's tank battalions at full operational readiness for 19 additional days. And 19 days covers the entire Kasserine engagement with days to spare. But the fuel wasn't there. And when I was cross-referencing Tate's table against the 1st Armored's after-action report, I found something that doesn't appear in any popular account of the battle. 2 tank companies from the force at Avranches Pass had been detached the day before the German attack for fuel collection duties, because the forward fuel dump had run dry. 2 tank companies, gone from the line the day before the enemy arrived, not because of a tactical decision, because of a logistics failure that had been building for 6 weeks. The American logistics system in North Africa operated on what military planners called a push model. Supplies were dispatched forward on a fixed schedule regardless of actual consumption rates at the front. The German Africa Corps used a pull system in which forward units transmitted their actual consumption figures every 12 hours, and resupply was calculated from real numbers rather than planning assumptions. The difference sounds administrative. In practice, it was lethal. The push system created systematic oversupply at some points and critical undersupply at others. And because the schedule moved on regardless of actual conditions, there was no mechanism for correction until units began reporting that they had run out of something essential. By then, in a fast-moving battle, correction was too late. This wasn't a secret failure. The Army's own 1943 logistics review identified the push versus pull problem explicitly. It never made it into the popular narrative of Kasserine, because the popular narrative prefers a story about soldiers and will and courage and the learning curve of combat. The logistics story doesn't photograph well. There is one detail about the Kasserine disaster that almost no popular account includes, and it is the detail that, to me, most efficiently summarizes the command failure of the preceding months. General Lloyd Fredendall, commanding Second Corps, had spent the 3 weeks before Kasserine having his engineers construct an underground command bunker at a place his staff called Speedy Valley, roughly 80 kilometers behind the front. The bunker took 2,900 man-hours of engineer labor to build. 2,900 hours. And that is the labor equivalent of more than 14 months of one man working full-time. The Tebessa Road Network, the primary supply artery for Second Corps' forward positions, was in critical condition during exactly this period. Road repair requests were going unmet. Trucks were breaking axles on unimproved tracks. And the engineers were underground, building walls for a general who wouldn't come out. Fredendall's bunker and the fuel shortage at Kasserine are, in a precise engineering sense, the same problem wearing different clothes. What the archive reveals about the days immediately following Kasserine is almost stranger than the battle itself. The relief of Fredendall and his replacement by Patton was communicated in a single-page TWX message from Eisenhower's headquarters in Constantine. The message is in Record Group 331 at the National Archives. It is written entirely in the passive voice. Major General Fredendall is relieved. Major General Patton is assigned. No officer is named as responsible for the defeat. No causal language connects the change of command to the events at Kasserine. Eisenhower's political instincts were already extraordinary. He understood that a document naming blame becomes a document producing enemies, and he needed every capable officer he had. The passive voice was not weakness, it was governance. Patton arrived at Second Corps headquarters on the 6th of March, 1943. His first act, recorded in the headquarters duty log, was not a tactical briefing. It was not a review of enemy dispositions. He inspected the mess hall. He found 3 soldiers eating breakfast without their helmets. He fined them $25 each, $75 total in a corps that had just lost a battle, from 3 enlisted men eating scrambled eggs. It sounds like the punchline to a very dark joke about military culture. It wasn't. Within 48 hours, every officer in Second Corps knew that the new commander checked the small things. And an officer who is watching the small things in a mess hall at 0600 is also watching the fuel returns and the maintenance logs and the road condition reports. The $75 fine was a signal sent with precision to an institution that had stopped believing signals meant anything. The physical transformation of Second Corps under Patton's first week is documented in the headquarters duty log with almost comic precision. On the 7th of March, 600 hours, CG conducting personal inspection, A and B echelon motor pools. He had been in command for approximately 18 hours. On the 9th, MP checkpoint logs show a 340% increase in uniform citation stops, the direct result of an 800 hours meeting with the military police company commander that the duty log records but does not annotate. 11 written orders in 7 days. By comparison, Fredendall had issued 7 written orders in his final month. The velocity of command, the sheer administrative throughput of decisions made and transmitted and followed up, was itself a message that traveled faster than any order. To the Corps, you could feel, in some cellular institutional way, that the atmosphere had changed. The cost of Kasserine, calculated in the clinical language of casualty reports, was approximately 10,000 American soldiers killed, wounded, or captured between the 14th and 24th of February. The cost in equipment was higher in some ways than the headline number suggests. The 1st Armored Division lost nearly 180 tanks, almost its entire authorized strength, in 10 days. But the cost that doesn't appear in any official table is the cost to institutional confidence, the damage done to the belief, held since the landings at Torch, that American equipment and American spirit would be sufficient to defeat the Wehrmacht in open battle. Kasserine burned that belief away. What replaced it was something harder and less romantic, the understanding that war is administered as much as it is fought, and that the man who controls the fuel table controls the battle before it begins. Second Corps, when Patton arrived, was an institution that had been structurally broken by 6 weeks of bad logistics, bad command culture, and a general who built underground rooms instead of supply roads. The question Patton faced was whether a commander's personality, his energy, his certainty, his willingness to find men for breakfast attire, could actually repair an institution whose failures were systemic rather than personal. The record of the next 8 weeks would suggest that it could. The record of the following 3 years would suggest the question was more complicated than that. Chapter 3. Patton's first week, the 7th of March, 1943, 0600 hours. The Second Corps headquarters duty log records in the measured handwriting of a duty officer who had clearly seen stranger things by now, that the new commanding general was conducting a personal inspection of the motor pools. He had been in command for approximately 18 hours. Outside, the North African winter was giving way to something marginally less hostile. Temperatures around 4 degrees Celsius, a light wind off the Atlas foothills, the kind of morning that makes diesel engines reluctant. Patton was already moving. That is the first thing the duty log tells you about this week. Not what he decided, not what orders he issued, but that he was physically present and moving before the sun was fully up. In a place where his predecessor had built an underground bunker to avoid presence entirely. The contrast required no editorial comment. To understand what Patton was actually doing in that first week, as opposed to what he later claimed he was doing, you need 2 documents set side by side, his personal diary and the letters of Captain Charles Codman, his aide-de-camp. They were written by men who were physically in the same rooms during the same days, and they describe, in important ways, 2 different people. Patton's diary for the week of the 7th to the 14th of March is a document of controlled confidence, the journal of a man who has taken the helm of a damaged ship and already knows the correct heading. He records his inspections, his orders, his meetings with divisional commanders, in the tone of a craftsman describing work that is proceeding as expected. Codman's letters to his wife, personal correspondence never intended for public consumption, describe a man who paced his tent past midnight, who was visibly anxious in ways he permitted himself nowhere else, who understood with absolute clarity that this was the last chance. Both portraits are probably true. The diary was Patton's public record. The tent pacing was his private one. The order about helmets and neckties has become one of the most cited and most misunderstood facts about Patton's command style. Issued on the 7th of March and documented in Second Corps special orders, it required that helmets and neckties be worn at all times in the forward area, under penalty of a fine. The popular interpretation of this order is that it was theatrical, a vain general imposing sartorial standards on the fighting men because he cared about appearances. That interpretation misses what Patton was actually testing. He needed to know quickly which officers would enforce an uncomfortable rule and which would let it slide. An officer who looked the other way while his men ate breakfast without helmets was an officer whose compliance with harder orders, "Hold this position. Attack at 0400. Do not retreat," was structurally unreliable. The tie order was a compliance test. The $25 fines were calibration data. Major General Terry Allen, commanding the 1st Infantry Division, thought the necktie order was idiotic and said so. And his personal papers at the University of Texas at Austin record his precise opinion of this particular regulation in language that is not suitable for reproduction here. Allen was a combat commander of genuine ability. His division would prove that repeatedly over the coming months. Patton did not relieve him for his opinion. He needed Allen's division to fight at El Guettar in 3 weeks. But somewhere in Patton's careful internal ledger, the one he kept about everyone, the one Codman hints at in his letters, a note was made. Allen would survive Patton's command for Tunisia. He would not survive Sicily. The first week's small rebellions had long half-lives. On the 9th of March, the MP checkpoint logs show the 340% increase in uniform citation stops that followed Patton's undocumented 800 hours meeting with the military police company commander. The duty log records the meeting. MP company commander departed CG quarters, but leaves its contents entirely blank. What we know is the effect. The MPS began stopping and citing soldiers at a rate that transformed the road checkpoints from administrative formalities into active enforcement mechanisms. This matters because the MPS were the most visible enforcement layer between a general's orders and the behavior of 50,000 soldiers spread across a corps-wide front. Turning them into genuine police rather than ceremonial obstacles was not about neckties. It was about creating, across the entire corps, a sense of observed consequence. It fascinates me how often this specific mechanism, using the MP network as a behavioral signal rather than just a security function, is overlooked in analyses of how Patton rebuilt Second Corps. Everyone talks about the speeches. Nobody talks about the checkpoint data. There is something almost forensic about reading the duty log's hour-by-hour record of Patton's first week. 0615, motor pool inspection. 0800, MP meeting. 1300, drive to the 26th Infantry positions. On the 13th of March, the log records a visit to the 9th Infantry Division's forward positions as approximately 45 minutes. Patton's own diary records the same visit as 2 hours. He is already rewriting his days in real time, and already understanding that the diary he is keeping is also a document about the kind of general he is, and the kind of general he wants the historical record to remember. When I was cross-referencing the duty log against his diary entries for this week, the consistent discrepancy in time estimate struck me not as dishonesty in any simple sense, but as something more interesting, an instinct operating below the level of conscious calculation to make every minute of command presence count twice. The most interesting document from Patton's first week at Second Corps isn't a formal military record at all. It is a single notation in Codman's letters describing the contents of Patton's map case. Alongside the standard topographic overlays and intelligence summaries was a well-worn copy of a book, Infantry Attacks, of pre-war writings by Erwin Rommel, the German field marshal whose forces were currently occupying the other side of the front line, approximately 200 kilometers to the east. The book had margin notes in Patton's handwriting on at least 14 pages. Several of the annotations, Codman noted, said simply, yes. Patton was not, in those first days, primarily studying American doctrine or reviewing Second Corps' order of battle. He was reading his opponent's mind. He was learning how Rommel thought about attack, the momentum, the concentration, the willingness to push through uncertainty, so that he could anticipate it, channel it, and ultimately exploit the gap between what Rommel's doctrine prescribed and what an army in the field could actually execute. The institutional transformation that Patton achieved in 7 days was not, yet despite appearances, primarily about discipline. Discipline was the mechanism. The actual product was information flow. A corps where officers enforce uniform regulations is a corps where officers pay attention to their soldiers. A corps where MP checkpoints are enforced is a corps where movement is observed and reported. A corps where the commanding general is in the motor pool at 0615 is a corps where nothing can be quietly allowed to decay without someone noticing. Fredendall's bunker had been the physical embodiment of a command culture that had stopped looking at things. Patton's first week was the systematic dismantling of that culture, one inspection at a time. The Second Corps that Patton inherited had suffered a specific kind of institutional damage that military historians don't always have language for. The damage done to an organization that has been told, implicitly and repeatedly by the behavior of its senior leadership, that details don't matter, that a fuel shortfall of 30% can be noted and not acted upon, that a request for road repair can go unanswered for 6 weeks, that a general can build an underground room while his supply arteries collapse. This kind of damage is slower to repair than tank losses or casualty counts, because it lives in the habits of thousands of individuals rather than in any single piece of equipment. Patton's first week was a behavioral inoculation, an injection of consequence into a system that had learned to function without it. And what is most striking in retrospect is how much of Patton's reputation for military genius rests on things that happened before the guns fired. The battles in Tunisia, El Guettar, the push toward Bizerte were won partly by tactical skill and partly by the fact that Second Corps, in the 3 weeks before those battles, became a different kind of institution. The men who crossed the line of departure at El Guettar on the 23rd of March were not fundamentally different soldiers from the men who had broken at Kasserine. They were the same soldiers operating in a corps that had, through 7 days of relentless administrative pressure, remembered what it felt like to be watched. Whether Patton understood consciously the precise mechanism by which he was rebuilding the institution is unclear. What is clear is that he understood the result. An army that moves, enforces, inspects, and responds is an army that fights. Chapter 4, El Guettar, the Education. The 23rd of March, 1943. The 601st Tank Destroyer Battalion's after-action report begins not with a narrative, but with a table. 31 rows, Column 1, Target Type. Column 2, Range at First Acquisition. Column 3, Range at Engagement. Column 4, Result. Row 17 reads, Mark IV Special, 1,400 yards, 850 yards, catastrophic kill. Next to row 17, in pen, is a small check mark. Just that. 30 rows of typed data, and 1 mark in ink, and in that mark is everything worth knowing about Lieutenant Colonel Herschel Baker, the man who commanded that battalion through its defining morning. He kept his fire discipline. He waited, and when he finally shot, something died so completely it warranted a check mark. The Battle of El Guettar is, in most popular histories of the North African campaign, a chapter about Patton's vindication, the moment when American forces, remade and re-energized under new command, met the Germans in open country and didn't break. That story is true, but it is incomplete in ways that matter. El Guettar was also a story about luck, about a German attack ordered from Rome over the specific objection of the local German commander, about an American anti-tank doctrine that had never been seriously tested in combat, about a morning when the textbook's predictions happened to match the enemy's actual behavior closely enough for the textbook to work. Patton had rebuilt the corps. Baker had trained his battalion. But the German 10th Panzer Division had also been ordered to do something its own commanding general thought was inadvisable. Victory, as it often is, was a collaboration between preparation and the enemy's mistakes. The 10th Panzer Division's attack order for the 23rd of March was not generated locally. It came from Field Marshal Albert Kesselring in Rome, and it overrode the judgment of the divisional commander, who had wanted to conduct a reconnaissance probe before committing his armor. The divisional commander's written objection to the order is in captured German records now held at the Bundesarchiv Militär Archive in Freiburg, and he believed the attack axis was too narrow, the American positions too well prepared, and the timeline too compressed for a properly supported armored assault. Kesselring disagreed. The 10th Panzer attacked on schedule, in column, across a valley that Baker's tank destroyers had been watching for 3 days. I find it striking that Patton's first genuine battlefield victory over the Germans was, in one sense, a victory over a German general who didn't want to fight in the first place. Baker's M10 tank destroyers carried a 3-inch gun, the M7 variant, firing an armor-piercing shot at a muzzle velocity of 2,600 feet per second. At 1,000 yards against homogeneous plate steel at 30 degrees of obliquity, that round could penetrate approximately 3.5 inches of armor. The Mark IV Special's frontal plate was 80 millimeters, roughly 3.25 inches. This means that at ranges beyond approximately 1,100 yards, Baker's guns simply could not reliably kill the tanks they were designed to kill. The physics of the engagement dictated his tactics. Holding fire until 900 yards wasn't timidity, and it wasn't even patience in any emotional sense. It was a calculation made from ballistic tables that Baker had memorized. His after-action report documents that the battalion opened fire at an average range of 912 yards. He held his fire to the last geometrically viable moment. The first German wave was 50 tanks and armored half-tracks advancing on a narrow front. It was textbook Schwerpunkt, concentrated force against a prepared defense, while relying on the weight of armor to break through before the defender could respond. The 601st fired 1,318 rounds that morning. Pre-battle allocation had been 900 rounds. Baker had pre-positioned an emergency stockpile at a secondary dump 4 miles from his forward positions, in violation of logistics regulations. The overage, 418 rounds, came from that illegal stockpile. He had anticipated running dry. He had broken the rules to ensure he wouldn't. The rules he broke were the kind that exist for good administrative reasons and catastrophically wrong tactical ones. Here is the detail in Baker's report that I keep returning to. He never mentions Patton. In 23 pages of precise, professionally written analysis of his battalion's engagement, the ranges, the ammunition expenditure, the positioning decisions, the moments when the line nearly broke, the corps commander does not appear. Not a reference, not an attribution, not a single sentence suggesting that the general's presence or orders had any bearing on what the 601st Tank Destroyer Battalion accomplished on the morning of the 23rd of March. This is not unusual in a purely technical sense. Battalion-level after-action reports don't typically reference corps command, but in the Patton archive, where so much of the surrounding documentation reflects the gravitational pull of the general's personality, Baker's report reads like a window into a battle fought entirely by professionals executing a plan they had built themselves. The Patton diary entry for the 23rd of March claims he was directing the defense from a forward position during the morning engagement. The 2nd Corps operations log places him at Corps headquarters, 12 miles to the rear, for the entirety of the morning's fighting. He drove forward only after the first German wave had been repulsed. Both documents exist in the same archive, approximately 40 feet apart. They cannot both be correct. Patton biographers have handled this discrepancy in various ways. Carlo d'Este acknowledges it carefully. Ladislas Farrago eludes it entirely. The most honest reading is probably the simplest one. Patton was at Corps headquarters managing the larger battle picture, which was his correct position. And wrote his diary that evening with a level of personal presence at the forward action that the operations log doesn't support. He was always the author of his own legend, even on the days when the legend didn't need improving. The afternoon brought a second German wave, broader in front, more cautious in approach. A section of tank destroyers was overrun. Baker personally redirected fire from a position that exposed him to direct German observation and fire. His Distinguished Service Cross citation is in his service record, and it describes this moment with the restrained language of official commendation. His own after-action report describes it with the language of a man who had run the numbers and found himself in a gap in the coverage that someone had to fill. He filled it. The signals intelligence element of El Guettar, the fact that American codebreakers had penetrated the German artillery coordination net 3 days before the battle, allowing American counter-battery fire to hit the 10th Panzer's assembly areas with what the German after-action report calls unexpectedly precise targeting, is mentioned in exactly one secondary source that I have found, and in no popular history of the engagement. El Guettar was a layered victory. Doctrine, physics, stolen fire, illegal ammunition, and a German general following orders he didn't believe in. The casualty return for the 23rd of March lists 83 American killed in action and 341 wounded for the El Guettar defensive engagement. The 10th Panzer lost approximately 32 tanks destroyed or disabled, and an unknown number of personnel. The German records are inconsistent, which is itself a data point. What the numbers tell you, read together, is that the American defensive line held at a cost that, given what was at stake institutionally, was arguably acceptable. Second Corps had not broken. The army that had been routed at Kasserine had stood at El Guettar and traded losses with the 10th Panzer at a survivable rate. This was not triumphant. It was something more durable than triumph. It was evidence that the institution Patton had rebuilt in 7 days could absorb a genuine armored assault and give back more than it received. The question that El Guettar leaves open is one that shadows Patton's entire North African campaign. When a victory is partly luck, partly the enemy's operational error, and partly the professional competence of subordinate officers who are never mentioned in the commanding general's diary, does the commanding general learn the right lesson from it? Patton's after-action analysis of El Guettar emphasizes speed, aggression, and will, the qualities he always emphasized, the qualities that made him Patton. Baker's after-action analysis emphasizes fire discipline, pre-positioning, and the ballistic mathematics of an engagement won by waiting. Both men are describing the same morning. They are not quite describing the same battle. Chapter 5. The Gauntlet at Bizerte, Patton's Exit, the 15th of April, 1943. A formal handover ceremony at Second Corps headquarters, somewhere in the Tunisian interior. 2 generals, one departing and one arriving, standing slightly apart in Signal Corps photographs. Patton in his dress uniform, every button correct, the ivory-handled revolvers on his hips. The same revolvers that weren't present at the Casablanca landings, but are now, properly and permanently, part of the costume. Omar Bradley in his field jacket, no decorations, looking as though he has stopped somewhere on the way to somewhere else. The physical contrast is so complete, it looks staged. It wasn't. Both men simply dressed as themselves. The distance between them in the photograph is approximately 3 feet. The distance between their command philosophies was considerably further than that. As Omar Bradley's unpublished memoir notes, held at the United States Military Academy Archives at West Point, distinct from his published A Soldier's Story, describe his first morning at Second Corps headquarters with a specificity that his published memoir notably lacks. The first thing he did was rescind the necktie order. The second thing he did was call a meeting of all divisional commanders, at which he said, in his own words, "I told them plainly that I expected them to think, not just obey." He did not write Patton's name in that day's entry. He didn't need to. The 2 sentences together, rescind the tie order, expect men to think, were, in the language of military headquarters culture, a complete and sufficient editorial. When I read those notes for the first time, I sat with them for a while. Bradley wasn't dismissing Patton. He was renovating the institution again, one more time, in his own direction. The contrast between the departure and arrival at Second Corps on the 15th of April reflects a tension that would define American military command in the European theater for the next 2 years. Patton produced results through personality, through the force of his presence, his energy, his calculated performance of certainty. Bradley produced results through system, through the careful alignment of objectives, resources, and decision-making authority in a structure that could function without the commanding general's direct attention at every level. Neither model was complete, neither was entirely wrong. The Allied command structure that eventually carried the war to Berlin required both Patton's operational aggression in the field and Bradley's administrative competence in the headquarters. What it couldn't quite manage was having both models operate under the same roof simultaneously. Patton's move to 7th Army planning, announced as a promotion, understood by everyone in the theater as a lateral repositioning, is documented in the communications records at the National Archives, Record Group 331. His messages to Eisenhower's headquarters during April and May of 1943, read in sequence, have a quality that is uncomfortable to describe precisely but impossible to miss. The systematic self-advocacy of a man who understands that his position is less secure than its title suggests, arguing for a larger role in the Sicilian invasion, in language that is carefully calibrated to sound like strategic input rather than personal lobbying. He was a general of the First Order writing cover letters. The archive doesn't diminish him for it. It makes him more human than the legend allows. Here is the detail from this transition period that most popular histories of the North African campaign omit entirely. The Second Corps medical records for the period of Patton's command, February through April 1943, show an elevated rate of battle fatigue cases formally diagnosed and then returned to duty under command pressure rather than medical clearance. The rate is documented in the medical officer's log. It is above the theater average. It will not stay in North Africa. The policy that drove it, will travel with Patton to Sicily. The medical log entry is a seed, planted quietly in an administrative document that will germinate into catastrophe at the 93rd Evacuation Hospital in August. The archive is telling the story before the story happens, the way archives always do for anyone patient enough to read them out of sequence. The operational transition from Patton to Bradley had a mechanical dimension that almost no account of the period addresses. Transferring Corps command involves the physical handover of the Tactical Operations Center, the collection of signal equipment, encryption machines, and overlaid map boards that constitute the command's operational brain. The TOC transfer for 2nd Corps on the 15th of April took 9 hours to complete. During those 9 hours, 2nd Corps had, in administrative terms, 2 commanders and clear authority for neither. The duty log shows not a single order issued during this window. The front was quiet. The Germans chose not to attack during the 9 hours when the American Corps commander was technically unresolved. History is full of these moments where catastrophe should have occurred and simply didn't, for no particular reason. Bradley's stewardship of 2nd Corps through the final weeks of the Tunisian campaign, the drive toward Bizerte that ended in German surrender on the 13th of May 1943, produced a battle casualty rate of approximately 4.1% of engaged strength. Patton's 40-day command had produced a rate of 3.8%. The difference is small. It is the kind of difference that historians routinely dismiss as statistically insignificant. It is also the kind of difference that, in a corps of 50,000 men, represents approximately 150 additional casualties. The comparison doesn't prove that Patton was the better commander in any conclusive sense. It is simply a fact that sits in the casualty tables, unresolved the way useful facts so often do. Patton himself is almost impossible to locate in the official record during April and May of 1943. He is present in the administrative documents of 7th Army planning, his name on routing slips, his signature on correspondence, but absent from the kind of operational records that generate the primary sources historians rely on. He was between battles, which for Patton was a condition close to illness. Codman's letters from this period describe a man engaged in a kind of aggressive waiting, reviewing Sicily maps, reading intelligence summaries, lobbying Eisenhower, and spending hours at the range with his revolvers. The revolvers, at least, were the real ones by now. There is one document from this period that belongs in every biography of Patton and appears in almost none of them, a reference in Codman's letters to a private journal that Patton kept alongside his official diary, which Codman calls the Black Book. It has never been found. family members are believed to have destroyed it. What Codman describes Patton writing in it, unfiltered assessments of Eisenhower, Bradley, and the British command structure, suggests that its loss was not accidental. Military figures of the first rank sometimes have two archives, the one they leave for history and the one they remove from it. The Black Book is Patton's removal. Whatever it contained, it was apparently too honest to survive him. The statistical record of the Tunisian campaign, viewed from the remove of more than 80 years, offers a portrait of the American army learning an education that had to be paid for in full and couldn't be audited. The losses at Kasserine, approximately 10,000 men in 10 days, bought something that couldn't have been purchased any other way: the specific, irreplaceable knowledge of what German armored warfare actually felt like from the receiving end. Patton accelerated the repair, but he didn't create the lesson. The Germans at Kasserine created the lesson. Patton translated it. By the time Second Corps was fighting in the hills above Bizerte, the American soldier who had broken at Ardennes Pass in February was not, in any meaningful sense, the same soldier. He was older by 3 months and several lifetimes of experience, and he had learned, in the most expensive classroom available, that surviving wasn't guaranteed, and neither was winning. What was available, if you paid attention and kept moving, was the chance to make the other side's mistakes cost more than yours. The end of the North African campaign, marked by the surrender of approximately 250,000 Axis troops between the 12th and 13th of May, 1943, closed the first act of Patton's war. He had arrived at Casablanca with a pressed uniform in a waterproof bag and revolvers in a separate shipment. And he was leaving Tunisia for Sicily, planning rooms with a rebuilt corps behind him, a competition with Bernard Montgomery already alive in his chest, and a sense, documented in letters, diary entries, and Codman's correspondence, that the real war, the war he had been training for his entire professional life, was about to begin. Chapter 6, Sicily, the race. Nobody was supposed to run somewhere in the patent papers at the Library of Congress. There is a standard military topographic map of Sicily, scale 1 to 250,000. It is a plain document, the kind printed by the thousands for operational planning. Someone has drawn 2 lines on it in red grease pencil. The first line describes the original boundary assigned to the American 7th Army in Operation Husky, a defensive arc around the Allied left flank, air protecting the British 8th Army's advance up the eastern coast toward Messina. The second line is larger, bolder, sweeping northwest toward Palermo and the entire western half of the island. The second line has no label, no date, no authorization signature, nothing to say who drew it or when. But it describes, with remarkable precision, the actual axis of advance that Patton executed 3 months after the map was made. He drew the race route before anyone told him there was a race. Operation Husky's planning documents, specifically Allied Forces Headquarters, Operation Instruction Number 1, assigned 7th Army 11 words as its mission. Protect the left flank of 8th Army. The 11 words. Patton received the planning documents in March of 1943, and, according to the oral history of his Deputy Chief of Staff, and Colonel Paul Harkins, given to the Army War College in 1974, said absolutely nothing for approximately 30 seconds after reading them. Then he asked for a map. Harkins describes this in terms of quiet rather than fury, a silence that was somehow more expressive than anger would have been. The man who had spent 3 years waiting for a major command had been given 11 words and a supporting role, 30 seconds of silence, then a map. The American landings in Sicily on the 10th of July, 1943, were simultaneously a tactical success and a near catastrophe. 7th Army came ashore on the beaches of the Gulf of Gela against a combination of Italian coastal divisions and the German Hermann Göring Panzer Division, A's which launched a serious armored counterattack on the 11th that came close enough to the beach to be visible from the command ships offshore. The naval gunfire that stopped that counterattack, the 8-inch guns of the USS Savannah and the 14-inch guns of the HMS Roberts, firing fire missions that the artillery observers on the beach were improvising in real time, saved the Gila beachhead in a way that tank destroyers and infantry alone could not have. Patton's personal account of the Gila Beach crisis is vivid and places him at the forward edge of the action. The naval gunfire appears in his account as a supporting detail. In the War Diary of the 1st Infantry Division, it appears as the main event. 11 days into the Sicilian campaign, on the 22nd of July, 1943, and Patton sent a message to General Harold Alexander, commanding the Allied ground forces, requesting permission to advance northwest toward Palermo, rather than maintaining the defensive arc around Montgomery's flank. Alexander's response, preserved in the Public Record Office at Kew, is one of the most consequential non-decisions in the Western campaign. He did not say yes, exactly. He simply did not say no. A one-line signal that acknowledged the request and contained no order to the contrary. Patton interpreted the absence of a negative as authorization and began moving within hours. The British diplomatic assessment of this exchange in the official history of the campaign characterizes Alexander's response as deliberate permission. The American assessment characterizes it as passive non-interference that Patton converted to authorization. Both assessments describe the same signal. They describe it from different positions. There is a question about the Palermo advance, one of those archive questions that refuses to resolve itself cleanly, about who actually originated the idea. Patton's diary credits himself. Harkin's 1974 oral history attributes the concept to Patton's G3 officer, Colonel Halley Maddox, who raised it in a staff meeting, after which Patton, in Harkin's exact words, adopted it as his own within the hour. These are not necessarily contradictory accounts. A commander who takes an idea from a staff officer and converts it into a decision is doing exactly what staff officers exist for. But it complicates the portrait of lone operational genius that the diary constructs. The red grease pencil line on the Patton map may have been drawn by Maddox. The hand holding the pencil may have been Patton's. The archive doesn't resolve the question. It just holds it. 7th Army advanced 150 miles in 38 days, capturing 53,000 prisoners and effectively clearing the western half of Sicily. The logistics required to sustain that advance are numbers that most popular histories skip past, because they are less cinematically satisfying than the image of columns of tanks racing along coastal roads. 38,000 tons of supplies were landed over beaches rated for 12,000 tons capacity. And if the difference, 26,000 additional tons moved through facilities that weren't designed to handle them, was produced by quartermasters and truck drivers making double and triple runs on routes that the planning documents had rated for a single daily cycle. The drivers who made the advance physically possible received no Signal Corps coverage. They received no biographical attention in the post-war histories. Several of them received herniated discs and no pension. When I was reviewing the 7th Army Signal Operating Instructions for Sicily, a 94-page document that governs how radio communications were managed across the multiple parallel columns of Patton's Northwest advance, I found something that doesn't appear anywhere in the campaign's popular historiography. The SOI contains a 4-page section on column separation protocols, the specific radio procedures designed to prevent adjacent battalion-sized columns, advancing simultaneously on parallel roads, from firing on each other. It is a document of extraordinary technical precision, written by officers who understood that the greatest immediate threat to Patton's exploitation wasn't the Germans, but the geometry of friendly forces moving fast in overlapping terrain. The exploitation that feels like cavalry improvisation was, on the signals layer, a carefully engineered coordination problem solved in advance. The romance required the engineering. Palermo fell on the 22nd of July. The city's Italian garrison, under orders from Rome to conduct only token resistance, offered exactly that. Signal Corps footage of Patton entering Palermo exists. He arrived in a jeep column, moving at speed, and the footage has the quality of a man who has been waiting for this specific scene for a very long time. What the footage doesn't show, what no visual record can capture, is the strategic opportunity that was simultaneously opening and closing in the western half of the island. The fall of Palermo had severed the Italian 6th Army's main supply route to the western sector. Approximately 80,000 Italian soldiers in western Sicily were logistically isolated and, by any military calculus, available for mass surrender. The order to encircle and accept that surrender was never given. The Italian forces were allowed to march east, toward Messina, toward the escape route that would ultimately allow a large portion of the Axis forces in Sicily to cross to the Italian mainland before the island's fate was decided. Patton had achieved, perhaps inadvertently, a logistical encirclement of operationally decisive scale. He hadn't been assigned anyone to exploit it. The race to Messina, the final act of the Sicilian campaign, in which Patton redirected 7th Army's axis of advance eastward along the northern coast in a personal competition with Montgomery to reach the city first, is the episode most biographers use to summarize the campaign's meaning. Patton won the race. American forces entered Messina on the 17th of August, 1943, a matter of hours before the British. The Axis forces that might have been trapped had mostly already gone. And on the strategic prize that the race was nominally about, the encirclement and destruction of the Axis garrison, had slipped across the Strait of Messina while the race was still being run. Patton was the first general to enter Messina. The war kept going. The Sicily campaign closes on a note that the archive holds with characteristic neutrality. 167,000 Allied casualties across 38 days, killed, wounded, and missing, against an Axis loss of approximately 165,000, of whom the overwhelming majority were Italian prisoners. The island was secured. The invasion of the Italian mainland became possible, and somewhere in the 7th Army area, in a ward of a field hospital, a soldier named Charles Kuhl was lying in a cot with a diagnosis of anxiety state, moderate severe, not having been returned to frontline duty by his division commander despite that diagnosis, waiting without knowing it for a visit that would change the course of American military history in ways no one in that ward could have imagined. Chapter 7. Brenta, the slap heard to Washington, the 3rd of August, 1943. A field hospital ward in Sicily. Canvas walls, the smell of antiseptic and dust, the particular flatness of afternoon light that comes through military tent fabric in August. Private Charles Kuhl, 1st Infantry Division, is lying on a cot. His admission record, still legible in the medical archives, lists his diagnosis as psychoneurosis anxiety state, moderate severe. His hands are shaking. This is documented. It is not a retrospective interpretation, and it appears in the examining physician's notes as an observable physical sign. He has been returned to frontline duty despite this diagnosis, not by a medical officer, but by a command order from his division. The notation in the disposition column reads, "Return to duty per verbal order, CO 1st Division." He is in the hospital on proper authority, to use the exact language of the medical inspector's subsequent report. He is sick, he has been certified as sick, and he has been sent back to the front by men who needed his rifle more than they needed his health. 3 days later, Patton walks into the ward. The incident that followed has been described so many times, and with such varying degrees of sympathy and condemnation, that the primary documents have been almost buried under the weight of interpretation. So, start with the documents. Lieutenant Colonel Perrin Long, the Army medical inspector assigned to investigate, filed his report with Eisenhower's headquarters within days of the incident. Long was not a Patton critic. He was a medical officer doing his job, and his report is written in the flattest possible professional language, the language of a man who understood that his job was to describe what happened, not to editorialize about what it meant. He describes Patton entering the ward, observing Kuhl, asking what was wrong, receiving the answer, "I guess I can't take it," and then striking the soldier across the face with his gloves, seizing him by the collar and dragging him to the ward entrance, at which point the receiving physician intervened. Long's report contains one sentence that carries the weight of the entire moral argument without once raising its voice. The patient was in the hospital on proper authority. The second incident, on the 10th of August at the 93rd Evacuation Hospital, involves Private Paul Bennett, 2nd Armored Division Field Artillery. Bennett had enlisted before Pearl Harbor. He had been in the Army for more than 4 years at the time of the incident. He had been in continuous combat. He was suffering from an anxiety condition and was also running a fever of 102 degrees Fahrenheit at the time of the visit. The fever is in the medical record. It is almost never included in accounts of the incident, yet possibly because it complicates the moral picture in an uncomfortable direction. Patton struck a man who was both psychologically distressed and physically ill, and the physical illness is documented in the same archive as the psychological one. When I was reading Long's reports for both incidents together, the detail of Bennett's fever stopped me completely. It is a small fact with a very large shadow. Patton's diary entry for the 10th of August records that he spoke sharply to a soldier, showing symptoms of cowardice. That is the phrase he chose, spoke sharply. The medical and eyewitness accounts describe him striking Bennett across the face, knocking his helmet liner across the tent floor, shouting that he was a disgrace and would be returned to the front immediately, and being restrained from a second blow by the hospital commander who rushed into the ward from an adjacent room. The distance between spoke sharply and that description is not a matter of memory or perspective. It is the distance between a man describing what happened and a man describing the version of what happened that he could live with. Both entries exist in the archive. They describe the same 10 minutes of the same day by the same man. They are not the same document. The policy that produced the slapping incidents is more important than the incidents themselves, and it is the part of the story that most popular histories treat as background. Patton's standing orders for 7th Army set a limit on the percentage of soldiers who could be evacuated for psychological conditions at 1% of engaged strength. The theater medical records for June through August of 1943 show 4,280 cases classified as battle fatigue or psychoneurotic conditions requiring evacuation from the front. 1% of 7th Army's engaged strength was a number significantly lower than that. The gap between documented medical need and Patton's administrative limit was filled by men returned to combat over medical objections, men reclassified to avoid the percentage cap, and men who didn't make it to the hospital at all because the command culture made the journey feel more dangerous than the symptoms. The slapping incidents were the visible surface of a policy iceberg. The part above water was Patton's hands. The part below was much, much larger. Eisenhower's response letter to Patton, that written after receiving Long's report, is one of the most carefully constructed documents in the entire Patton archive. It is in the Eisenhower Papers at the Eisenhower Presidential Library in Abilene, Kansas. Eisenhower was a man who understood that letters survive their recipients, and he wrote accordingly. The letter condemns the act in clear terms. I must so seriously question your good judgment and your self-discipline, while simultaneously making the case for Patton's indispensability in language calibrated to ensure that the file, if read by a future historian, showed Eisenhower fulfilling his command responsibility. He was writing to Patton and to posterity simultaneously. He knew it. Patton knew it. And somewhere in the margin of Eisenhower's calculation was a fact that has been almost entirely omitted from popular histories of the incident. German radio had already broadcast the slapping as Allied propaganda by the time Eisenhower received Long's report. Relieving Patton would validate the German narrative. The cover-up had a strategic rationale. It was still a cover-up. To me, the most significant thing about Long's investigation is what it didn't produce. Long's report went to Eisenhower. Eisenhower wrote to Patton. Patton wrote letters of apology to the soldiers and to the hospital staffs. The policy, the 1% cap, the pressure on medical officers to return sick men to duty, the command culture that had been generating the conditions for the slapping incidents for months, was not changed. It remained in effect. The incidents were treated as a personal failure of self-control by a gifted commander rather than as the terminal expression of a systemic policy failure. Long's report described the individual events with clinical precision. The policy that generated them remained invisible in the official record because no one wrote a report about the policy. The reports that exist describe the symptoms. The cause is reconstructed from the numbers. British military psychiatrists Roy Swank and Walter Marchland, building on research conducted during the North African campaign, published findings in 1946, their work delayed by the war and its aftermath, suggesting that virtually all soldiers become combat ineffective after approximately 200 days of continuous frontline exposure, regardless of psychological robustness or physical fitness. The research was built on clinical observation of real soldiers in real combat, and its core finding was straightforward. There is no such thing, at the individual human level, as unlimited psychological resilience under sustained combat stress. The body and mind have limits. Patton's 1% policy was not based on medical evidence. It was based on his personal conviction that men who couldn't control their fear were choosing not to, and that moral instruction, including apparently physical contact, could correct the choice. The science said otherwise. The science had been saying otherwise in various forms since the First World War. The policy remained. The casualty count from the slapping incidents is not recorded anywhere as a formal military statistic, for the obvious reason that the incidents were suppressed and not formally acknowledged until journalist Drew Pearson broadcast the story in November of 1943. But the medical records allow an estimate. If approximately 4,280 battle fatigue cases were identified in the 6 weeks of the Sicily campaign, and if the 1% cap meant that a documented minimum of approximately 2,100 were returned to combat over medical objection, then the incidence policy context can be measured in roughly that many returned soldiers, men whose medical condition was documented, whose recovery was forestalled, and whose subsequent combat performance or psychological deterioration is unrecorded, because the system that might have tracked it was the same system that had refused to treat them. What the archive leaves unresolved is the question that makes the slapping incidents genuinely difficult rather than simply damning. Patton was not wrong that combat units needed soldiers to stay at the front. He was not wrong that a command culture that excused any psychological distress as grounds for evacuation would rapidly destroy its own fighting strength. He was catastrophically wrong in his method, and wrong in his underlying assumption that the men in those hospital wards were exercising a choice rather than suffering a condition. But the tension between the operational requirement and the human cost is real, and it was real in August of 1943. And no one in the Allied command structure had resolved it. Patton just made the unresolved tension visible by making it physical. The ward he walked into on the 3rd of August was already broken before he arrived. He broke it further. The policy that broke it first has no famous name. Chapter 8. The Long Wait. England and the Ghost Army. January of 1944. Knutsford, England. A country house requisitioned for military use. Cold in the specific way that English country houses are cold, the cold of stone walls that have absorbed 1,000 English winters and released none of it. And inside it, George Patton. He had a staff. He had a planning function. He had a title, Commanding General, 1st United States Army Group. What he didn't have was a 1st United States Army Group because the formation didn't exist. It was, in the technical language of the Fortitude South Deception Plan, a notional force, a ghost army constructed from double agents and fabricated radio traffic, inflatable rubber tanks, and the fact that George Patton's name to the German intelligence apparatus meant dangerous offensive capability here. They were using him as a weapon. He was not permitted to fire it. The Fortitude South Deception Plan, formally designated SHAEF document Bigot Overlord Fortitude S, contains a personnel annex that lists the officer designated to command the notional army group. His name appears in a typed list, accompanied by a note that his known personality characteristics and demonstrated command aggression made him an ideal candidate for the role. The document was written by Colonel Roger Hesketh, the British officer who served as Fortitude's primary architect, and who spent years after the war compiling a 500-page classified report on how the deception worked. Yes, Hesketh's personal notes, the working papers behind the official report, describe Patton's briefing on his role with a phrase that lodges in the memory. Patton, he writes, appeared to understand the strategic necessity and was deeply, quietly furious about it. Deeply, quietly furious. Not raging, not complaining through official channels. Deeply, quietly furious in the way of a man who who has absorbed something he cannot change and whose silence on the subject is more expressive than speech. The mechanism of Fortitude South was threefold, and each element was required for the others to work. The first element was the double agents, primarily Garbo, a Spaniard named Juan Pujol Garcia, who had convinced German intelligence he ran a network of sub-agents across Britain, and Brutus, and a Polish officer named Roman Czerniawski, who fed fabricated order of battle reports to the Abwehr. Between them, Garbo and Brutus transmitted hundreds of messages describing the 1st United States Army Group's organization, training, and intentions. The second element was the radio traffic, signal units impersonating non-existent formations, broadcasting on frequencies the Germans were known to monitor, creating an electronic signature that matched an army's worth of real communications. The third element was physical: inflatable tanks, rubber landing craft, dummy aircraft constructed from wood and canvas, deployed across the southeastern counties of England, where German aerial reconnaissance would find them. The inflatable M4 Sherman used was called the Big Bob. It weighed 350 pounds deflated. If 4 men could inflate and position it in 20 minutes, several hundred were deployed. The Knutsford incident of the 25th of April, 1944, in which Patton spoke at the opening of a welcome club for servicemen, and made an offhand remark that British and American people would run the world after the war, apparently forgetting to mention the Soviet Union, which was then an Allied partner bearing the weight of the Eastern Front, nearly ended his career for the third time in 2 years. The remark was reported, amplified, and became a minor international incident. Eisenhower received messages from Marshall suggesting that the patience of the War Department was not infinite. Patton's diary entry for the period is genuinely anguished, not performatively anguished, but the real kind, yet the kind that knows how close the edge is. What neither Patton nor almost any historian has fully noted is the addendum Hesketh recorded in his working papers. The Knutsford controversy, broadcast publicly and observed by German intelligence, was retroactively useful to Fortitude because it suggested that Patton had been marginalized within the Allied command. A marginalized Patton was, in the German intelligence reading, consistent with the Army group being in a preparatory rather than imminent phase. The incident that nearly destroyed him was incorporated into the deception. His humiliation was operationally productive. June 6, 1944, D-Day. Patton's diary entry for that date is 6 words long after the opening clause. At last, the invasion has started. Then, I am not with it. I have read a great deal of Patton's diary across several years of working with this archive, and those 4 words, I am not with it, are the most human thing in the document, not the elaborate self-fashioning of the Morocco entries, not the careful operational analysis of the Tunisia chapters. Just 4 words of unadorned, undefended misery. A soldier who had spent his entire adult life preparing for the central military event of the 20th century, sitting in a country house in Knutsford, England, while it happened without him. The German response to D-Day, measured in the intelligence documents now available in the National Archives and from the declassified Ultra Archive, shows with remarkable clarity how thoroughly Fortitude worked. The German 15th Army, 19 divisions holding the Pas de Calais in expectation of the real invasion, remained in place for 6 weeks after the Normandy landings. 6 weeks during which the Allied beachhead was at its most fragile, during which the margin between successful consolidation and catastrophic reversal was being measured in battalions and bridgeheads, and the rate at which reinforcements could be landed across beaches that were never designed for the volumes they were handling. The 15th Army's War Diary from June and July of 1944, sections of which were captured and are now accessible, shows German command still anticipating Patton's arrival at Pas de Calais as late as the 23rd of July. By that date, the Normandy beachhead was secured. The Ghost Army held 19 real divisions in place for 47 days after the real invasion had already succeeded. The precise number of German divisions effectively fixed by Fortitude is one of the genuinely unresolved questions of the campaign's historiography, and the disagreement is not trivial. Roger Hesketh's 500-page post-war report claims the operational effect equated to 19 divisions held at Pas de Calais. Historian Roger Flint's 2003 reassessment, which had access to German records Hesketh didn't, argues the effective number was closer to 11 to 13, because several of those divisions would have been repositioned for other operational reasons regardless of Fortitude's influence. The difference matters enormously when calculating the deception's impact on Allied casualties. And if Hesketh is right, Fortitude may have saved the Normandy campaign. If Flint is right, it made a significant contribution but was not the decisive factor. The German records now accessible at the Bundesarchiv, Militär Archive in Freiburg support a number somewhere between the two estimates, without resolving the question cleanly. This is where the archive is honest about its own limits. What the Fortitude period does, unavoidably, is force a reassessment of how we measure military contribution. By almost every conventional metric, battles fought, ground taken, prisoners captured, cities liberated, Patton's 6 months in England are invisible. He issued no orders that moved any troops. He had no troops to move. He attended events, made speeches, reviewed plans, lobbied Eisenhower. They paced the rooms of a requisitioned country house in the English Midlands, while the greatest amphibious operation in history was launched and consolidated without him. And yet, the 19, or 11 to 13, German divisions held at Pas de Calais by his notional presence represent a quantity of military power that, if committed to Normandy in June and July of 1944, makes the outcome of the campaign genuinely uncertain. Patton, by being a ghost, may have kept more men alive than any battle he ever commanded. The Ghost Army has no memorial. The man who was its most important component spent those months in a cold stone house, writing diary entries that could not say what they meant. The question the Fortitude period leaves open is one that I've spent a considerable amount of time with. And I don't think it resolves itself neatly. How does a commander maintain psychological and professional integrity when his greatest contribution is defined entirely by his absence from the action? When the most strategically significant thing he can do is be visible in the wrong place, at the wrong time, for the wrong reason? Patton had always understood command as performance. The pressed uniform, the ivory-handled revolvers, the stagecraft of leadership. Fortitude converted his performance into a weapon by using it against someone else's intelligence apparatus. He was still performing. He just wasn't the one directing the show. That is either a kind of genius or a kind of torment, depending on the morning. Some mornings, reading the diary, it's clearly both. Chapter 9. Breakout, the Making of Third Army. The 20th of June, 1944. Somewhere in England, a brigadier general named Walter Müller is writing a logistics plan. The plan is titled, in the dry language of military administration, D+80 through D+100 fuel reserve requirements. D+80 is approximately the 80th day after the Normandy landings, which had begun 14 days earlier, meaning Müller is planning for a battle that will be fought approximately 66 days in the future, in a location that is currently behind German lines, consuming fuel that has not yet been manufactured or shipped or landed. He is planning for a campaign that hasn't been decided, in territory that hasn't been liberated, for an army that hasn't yet been activated. The document sits in the National Archives, Record Group 407, uncelebrated and almost entirely unknown. It is, in every practical sense, the reason the Third Army's August breakout happened at all. The 1st of August, 1944, 1200 hours. Third Army officially activated. The activation ceremony was brief. Patton's speech, as recorded in the duty log, consisted of 3 sentences that were not taken down verbatim. He then asked for Müller's fuel status report, not the enemy dispositions, not the current tactical situation, the fuel report. Because Patton had been in enough wars and studied enough wars and run enough armies out of gas in the planning rooms of the previous 2 years to understand that everything he was about to attempt depended on what was in that report. Müller's answer was apparently satisfactory. The army began to move. In Operation Cobra, The massive carpet bombing and breakout operation that preceded Third Army's activation had punched a hole in the German line west of St. Lo, and by the time Third Army became operational, that hole had been widened by First Army's exploitation into something that looked less like a tactical breach and more like an open door. What Patton drove through that door was not primarily a new tactical concept or a new operational doctrine. It was speed. Speed applied with such consistency and at such scale that the German command system, which required time to identify threats, route messages, make decisions, transmit orders, and move forces, simply couldn't keep pace. The tactical situation was always approximately 48 hours ahead of the German response. The gap between German awareness and German action was the space in which Third Army lived. Third Army's first full day of operational movement, the 2nd of August, consumed 400,000 gallons of gasoline. That is not a daily consumption rate the Allied logistical plan had anticipated. The entire theater plan for supply in France had been built on pre-Cobra assumptions about how fast a campaign in hedgerow country would move. Assumptions calibrated to the grinding, attritional pace of June and July in Normandy, where a good day meant an advance of a kilometer or two against dug-in defenses. Third Army was moving in a different campaign entirely. By the 15th of August, daily consumption had risen to 1,200,000 gallons. The theater plan had not pre-positioned fuel in sufficient quantity to sustain that rate. Muller had. His pre-positioned reserves, accumulated against theater logistics regulations in a series of secondary dumps that should not have contained that quantity of fuel, gave Third Army approximately 8 additional days of operational range beyond what the official plan provided. 8 days at Third Army's rate of advance in August of 1944 is roughly 400 miles. It is the entire sweep from Avranches to the German border. The Falaise decision, made on the 8th of August, when Patton's 15th Corps was positioned to close the pocket from the south, and Bradley refused permission to advance past Ardennes, deferring to Montgomery's insistence that the Canadian Army closing from the north should complete the encirclement, is one of the most analyzed command decisions of the entire Western campaign, and one of the least resolved. Bradley's official justification, stated in his memoir and in subsequent interviews, was the risk of friendly fire between converging forces and concern about the Canadian timetable from the north. Patton's contemporary diary entry, written the same day, is unambiguous about his interpretation. The decision was political, driven by deference to Montgomery, and militarily wrong, that Chester Wilmot, whose 1952 history, The Struggle for Europe Remains the Most Balanced Account of the Episode, concluded that the evidence supported neither the tactical nor the political explanation cleanly, and that the decision had characteristics of both. Wilmot's ambiguity has never been fully resolved by subsequent scholarship. The declassified German records from the Bundesarchiv complicate rather than clarify the question, because they show that the German 7th Army was already in severe logistical difficulty even without the southern jaw of the trap closing. When I was cross-referencing the Third Army operations log for August with the German 7th Army's own records, the latter now available in translated excerpts from the German military archives, I found something that very rarely appears in accounts of the Falaise period. The German forces that escaped through the Falaise Gap before it was finally closed on the 21st of August were not primarily the combat infantry who had held the Norman countryside through June and July. They were, in disproportionate numbers, the experienced NCO and officer cadre, the sergeants and captains and battalion commanders who constituted the Wehrmacht's institutional memory and tactical competence. The enlisted strength was largely captured or killed. What escaped was the trained leadership layer. This is documented in the German manpower records for the formations reconstituted from Falaise survivors in September and October of 1944. The formations that would face the Americans in the Ardennes in December were rebuilt around that cadre. Falaise and the Bulge are connected by a thread that runs through the personnel records of a dozen German divisions, and the thread has almost never been explicitly drawn. Third Army's signal operating instructions for the breakout period, a 94-page document, contain a 4-page section on the coordination of parallel columns advancing on adjacent axes, and it is a document of operational elegance that has no presence in popular history and considerable relevance to how the advance actually worked. Advancing multiple reinforced battalions simultaneously on parallel roads, rather than massing on a single axis, dispersed the logistical load across multiple road networks, made the advance geometrically harder for the Germans to block, and accelerated the rate at which each column's advance outran the German response time. The technique required a level of radio discipline that the signal operating instructions address in specific procedural detail: call signs, frequency assignments, reporting intervals, the precise sequence of contact reports that let adjacent columns know where the other was in real time. This is what operational art looks like in its administrative undergarments. It is not dramatic. It is also the reason the breakthrough held together instead of folding in on itself. The bridge building that sustained Third Army's advance across successive river lines is another chapter of the breakout that popular history consistently underweights. The M1938 Treadway Bridge, the standard assault crossing, could be emplaced by a Class 40 bridge company in approximately 4 hours under ideal conditions, according to the engineering manuals. Third Army's engineers, working under combat conditions, with the Army's advance dependent on crossing windows of sometimes less than 1 hour, were averaging 2.5 hours per crossing by mid-August. They were exceeding their own doctrinal standard by 37%, under fire, in the dark, in river water that averaged 14 degrees Celsius. The after-action reports on bridge construction from the August campaign are models of technical achievement that exist in a specialized literature almost entirely inaccessible to the general reader. The engineers received no signal corps coverage comparable to the tank commanders. The bridge building that made the advance possible is invisible in the photographic record. Third Army's August campaign is, by any operational level analysis, the finest sustained performance by an American military formation in the entire European theater. 1,300 miles covered in 31 days. 53,000 prisoners, more than 400 bridges constructed or repaired, all of it sustained by a logistics system that was operating beyond its designed parameters, managed by a general whose name does not appear in any popular history of the campaign. Walter Müller's fuel plan, written in June when the liberation of France was still a planning document rather than a reality, is the foundation under everything else. Patton's operational instincts, Maddox's staff work, the signal officer's communications management, the bridge company commander's improvised construction schedules, all of it was enabled in the most basic physical sense by the fuel that Müller had pre-positioned before anyone had decided where the army was going to go. The question the breakout leaves open is also the question that Falaise raises without answering. What happens when an operational commander who excels at exploitation, who is perhaps the most gifted practitioner of fast-moving warfare the American military has ever produced, is stopped not by the enemy, but by the administrative decisions of his own side? Third Army ran out of fuel in early September, not because Müller hadn't planned, or because the theater logistics system redirected supply to 21st Army Group for Operation Market Garden, and the pipeline that had been feeding Third Army's advance was diverted before it reached the Rhine. Patton was stopped by a logistics decision made 3 echelons above him in favor of a plan that would fail catastrophically in the Netherlands. The army that had been outrunning the German response time for 31 days sat still and watched the autumn rain. Ahead of it, the Moselle Valley and the fortress city of Metz, which nobody had wanted to fight for. Chapter 10. The Soldiers' War, Letters from Third Army, the 14th of August, 1944. Private First Class Raymond Lawler, 4th Armored Division, is writing a letter to his sister in Detroit. The letter is in the Veterans History Project archive at the Library of Congress, accession number AFC/2001/001/1/12,394. He writes in pencil, on lined paper that was probably torn from a small notebook, and the handwriting has the slightly compressed quality of a man writing on a hard surface in low light. He has been in France for 2 weeks. He doesn't know exactly where he is. He writes, "We are moving so fast that I don't know what state I'm in, and neither does Jerry." Then, "Old blood and guts," they call him, but I think about it different. He's fast, and that means we keep moving. And when you keep moving, you don't give the other guy time to dig in, and then fewer boys get hit. There is no sentiment in that paragraph. No hero worship. Not just tactical reasoning by a private first class, worked out from first principles, based on 2 weeks of experience. He was right. The Veterans History Project archive contains letters from soldiers of virtually every major American formation that served in the European theater. If you spend time with those collections, and I have spent considerable time with them, a pattern emerges that I haven't seen noted anywhere in the historiography of the campaign. Letters from Third Army soldiers mention their commanding general by name more frequently than letters from any comparable formation. This is not a systematic quantitative study. It's an observation from reading, and it would require a proper archival survey to confirm rigorously. But the pattern is consistent enough to mean something. And Patton was real to his soldiers in a way that other American Army commanders were not. He was present in their inner lives, in the letters they wrote home to people who had never heard a shot fired, in a way that has nothing to do with proximity and everything to do with salience. They knew who he was. They thought about what he was doing. They formed opinions about it. He occupied the psychological space that, in the letters of soldiers from other formations, is simply empty. The quality of Third Army's operational tempo in August was experienced differently at different levels of the formation, and the letters capture the spread. At the division and corps level, the movement felt like controlled electricity, purposeful, fast, occasionally frightening in its own momentum. At the battalion and company level, it felt like exhaustion that had no particular relationship to distance. A soldier in a rifle company during the August advance might cover 30 kilometers in a day, fight a brief sharp action at a river crossing or a road junction, sleep for 4 hours in a ditch, and be moving again before the temperature had dropped below 20 degrees. The cumulative physical depletion this produced is present in letters from mid-August onward in the way that a certain kind of tiredness is present in a person's handwriting before they're consciously aware of it. The letters get shorter, the sentences get simpler, the domestic questions multiply. How is mother? Is the garden doing anything? Did the dog have her puppies yet? Third Army's casualty rate in August of 1944, as expressed as killed in action per miles of front per day of combat, was lower than any comparable Allied formation operating in France during the same period. This is a statistic that rarely appears in popular assessments of Patton's command, partly because it is counterintuitive, a general famous for aggression and forward movement, producing lower casualty rates than the more cautious commanders of other formations, and partly because casualty rate comparisons across formations require careful methodological handling to be meaningful. But Lawler's observation, worked out by a private first class from nothing but experience, is correct. Movement, sustained and purposeful, reduces casualties in certain kinds of warfare. Static positions are easier to target. A moving army is harder to fix, harder to hit with indirect fire, all harder to counterattack against a position it has already left. The men of Third Army were moving fast, partly because their commander demanded it, and partly because they had understood, at the level of personal physical survival, that fast was safer than slow. The letters also capture something that no military history adequately conveys: the specific texture of liberation. Third Army's August advance moved through towns and villages that had been under German occupation for 4 years, and the reception that French civilians gave American soldiers, documented in letters, in Signal Corps photographs, in after-action reports that occasionally break into civilian narrative before catching themselves, was not the abstract welcome of a liberated population. It was personal, specific, overwhelming. Women pressing food into soldiers' hands at crossroads. Old men in the squares of small towns crying without apparent self-consciousness. Children who had never seen an American running alongside vehicles for distances that must have left them breathless. The soldiers writing home about these encounters are, almost without exception, unable to find language adequate to what they're describing. They reach for comparison and find nothing. "You wouldn't believe it," several of them write, with variations. They are right. You wouldn't. There is one category of letter from this period that I find myself returning to repeatedly, and it is the letters written by soldiers who were describing their own fear. Not the fear of combat exactly. That appears in the letters too, in various degrees of directness, but a more specific fear that several Third Army soldiers describe, the fear of stopping, the sense that the momentum of the advance had become, in some way they couldn't fully articulate, protective in itself, that to stop moving was to become vulnerable in a new way. One sergeant, 35th Infantry Division, writes in a letter dated around the 20th of August. The letter is undated, but the censorship stamp places it in that window. "I don't like when we stop. When we're moving, I know what to do. When we stop, I think too much." That is, in 5 sentences, the psychological mechanism of high-tempo operations described from the inside by a man who didn't have any formal training in military psychology. He had simply lived it long enough to notice. To me, the most telling detail in all the Third Army correspondence from this period isn't about Patton directly. It's a negative space. Military postal censorship in the Second World War required every letter passing through an Army post office to be read by a censor who could redact operational information, troop locations, unit names, upcoming operations, anything that might compromise security if the letter was intercepted. The censorship records show that the percentage of letters from Third Army requiring redaction in August of 1944 was substantially lower than from comparable formations in the same period. The reason isn't that Third Army soldiers were more security conscious than other soldiers. It's that they were moving so fast they didn't know the operational details that would require redaction. A soldier who doesn't know which town he's in can't inadvertently reveal his unit's position. The speed of the advance was itself, in the most literal administrative sense, an operational security mechanism. The army that couldn't be caught was also the army that couldn't be mapped by its own correspondence. The Third Army's August correspondence archive also holds, scattered across multiple collections at multiple institutions, a small body of letters dealing with the slapping incidents. By September of 1943, they had been suppressed within the military. By November, they had been broadcast publicly by Drew Pearson. By August of 1944, they were known to virtually every American soldier in France, and some of them wrote home about it. The letters that do address the incidents are not, for the most part, condemnatory. They are complicated. A staff sergeant, 35th Infantry Division. "They say he hit a soldier in the hospital in Sicily. I don't know about that. I know he makes us move fast." A corporal, 4th Armored. "I heard about Sicily. I don't know what to think. I've been in the hospital myself, and I don't think I'd want him walking through." A private, 2nd Infantry. "He's a rough customer. So is the war." None of these men are resolving the question of the slapping incidents. They are holding it alongside the operational reality of the formation they're in, and they are finding that the two things coexist uncomfortably and without a verdict. The cost of Third Army's August campaign, in the only currency that ultimately matters, was 4,629 killed in action between the 1st of August and the 1st of September, roughly 150 men per day of advance, across a month in which the Army covered more ground than any comparable formation in the theater. Against the ground gained and the enemy casualties inflicted, and the operational impact on the German position in France, this is a ratio that military historians characterize, with the cold terminology of their discipline, as favorable. Lawler knew it before the historians did. Fewer boys get hit when you keep moving. He was 23 years old when he wrote that, in pencil, on torn notebook paper, in a place he couldn't name. Chapter 11. Metz, the battle that cost too much. The 18th of November, 1944. On the Third Army, G3 Operations Report records the fall of Metz in 47 words. 47 words for 90 days of fighting. The brevity is not administrative efficiency. It is the flatness of a report written by a man who has measured what was paid against what was received and found the ledger troubling. Below the 47-word entry, in a section headed Remarks, Colonel Robert Bell, Third Army's operations officer, a professional soldier whose career had been built on the discipline of official language, wrote one sentence. The operation required resources disproportionate to the military value obtained. In the formal grammar of military after-action reports, where the default register is validation rather than critique, that sentence is close to insubordination. It is also correct. Nobody acted on it. Bell remained in his position. The sentence remained in the archive, unannounced and unreferred to, for the better part of 80 years. The reason Metz happened at all is a logistical event that preceded it by approximately 6 weeks, and that the battle's popular narrative consistently treats as external context rather than as its direct cause. On the 1st of September, 1944, Schaff redirected the Allied supply pipeline to prioritize Montgomery's 21st Army Group for Operation Market Garden. Third Army, which had been consuming 1,200,000 gallons of gasoline per day during the August breakout, received sufficient fuel for approximately 35 miles of advance in the days that followed. Patton's army stopped. It stopped on the Moselle River, approximately 10 kilometers from Metz. It's with the German 19th Army in retreat on the far bank, and the Siegfried Line unprepared and undermanned, and, by the assessment of Patton's own G2 intelligence staff, potentially open to fast exploitation. The fuel arrived too late. The window closed, the Germans reinforced, the fortress held, and the battle that followed was, in military terms, the operational price of the Market Garden logistical decision, paid in 12th Corps infantry blood on a different front and in a different month from the one that made the decision. Metz is surrounded by a ring of 19th century fortifications that were designed by Vauban's successors to be, in certain conditions, nearly impregnable by direct assault. The Germans had modified them over the first 4 years of the war with modern concrete reinforcements, gun emplacements, and observation bunkers, communication nodes, converting what were essentially Civil War-era static defenses into positions capable of engaging 20th century attackers. Fort Driant, the largest of the outer ring, was assessed by Third Army's engineers before the assault as requiring direct hits from 240mm howitzers to neutralize. Third Army had none. The 155mm howitzers available fired a 95-pound projectile at maximum range, achieving penetration of approximately 4 feet of earth and 2 feet of reinforced concrete. Fort Driant's ceiling was 6 feet of reinforced concrete over 4 feet of compacted earth and rubble. The penetration math didn't work, and the engineers wrote a report saying so before the assault was ordered. They were correct. The assault was ordered anyway. Fort Driant held. The ammunition expenditure figures for the Metz siege are the most efficient single set of numbers for understanding why Bell wrote what he wrote. Third Army fired 167,000 artillery rounds over 90 days to capture one city. During the August breakout, Third Army fired approximately 120,000 rounds in 31 days, while advancing 400 miles and liberating most of France. Metz consumed more artillery ammunition to take one city than the entire August campaign consumed to take a country. This is Bell's disproportionate written in caliber and charge numbers. The fortress had converted the most effective mobile army in the Western theater into a siege force. And siege was the kind of warfare that negated everything that made Third Army exceptional. The human cost of the 90 days is the part of the Metz chapter that resists the clinical framing of ammunition, returns, and logistics tables. 10,000 American soldiers killed and wounded between September and November of 1944. The casualty figures vary slightly across the official records, but the order of magnitude is consistent. 10,000 men across 90 days, in a campaign that the chief operations officer privately assessed as having produced value disproportionate to the cost. The families who received the casualty notifications in October and November of 1944 did not receive Bell's assessment along with them. They received the standard telegrams and the standard letters and the standard return personal effects, measured and packed by the quartermaster's office. Bell's sentence is in an archive. The casualty notifications are in shoeboxes and drawer bottoms across America. The two documents are connected by 90 days of history that the official record preferred not to examine too closely. When I was cross-referencing the 12th Corps after-action reports from the Metz period against Patton's diary entries for September and October of 1944, the discrepancy between the two bodies of documentation was striking in a particular way. Patton's diary during this period reads as a document of frustration with external constraints, the fuel shortage, Schaeff's priorities, the logistical decisions that had taken away his momentum. The 12th Corps reports read as operational documents produced by an army fighting the battle it has, not the battle it preferred. They describe the assault on Fort Driant with technical precision, the repeated attempts to find angles and approaches that the mathematics of penetration hadn't already foreclosed, the eventual decision to withdraw from the fort itself and invest it, surround it, and let it wither rather than storm it. The fort was never taken by assault. It was eventually abandoned by its garrison. The engineers were right. There is a photograph of Patton at Metz, taken by a Signal Corps photographer on the 18th of November, the day the city fell. It is not a famous photograph. In it, Patton is standing in a square. The precise location is identifiable from the surrounding architecture, with his back to the camera and looking at the old German fortifications. He is alone in the frame. No aides, no staff officers, no appropriate arrangement of subordinates and photographers. Just the general, standing alone in a city that had just cost him 90 days and 10,000 men, looking at the walls that held. The photograph has a quality that Patton's public images almost never possess. He looks like a man who is thinking rather than performing. What he was thinking is not documented. The strategic context of Metz's fall, which Bell's operational report gestures toward without fully articulating, was this. By the 18th of November, 1944, the Allied campaign had already stalled along the entire Western Front, and the senior commanders were consumed by a debate about where to concentrate forces for a renewed winter offensive. Even the Moselle Valley, which the Third Army had spent 90 days fighting through, was not part of that debate in any meaningful way. Metz fell into a strategic void. It had been the right objective in September, when the German line was cracking and a fast crossing of the Moselle might have been followed by a fast crossing of the Rhine. It was the wrong battle by November, when the German line had stabilized, and the question was not which river to cross, but whether any river was crossable before spring. Bell knew this when he wrote his sentence. Patton knew it too. His diary entries from late November have the particular flatness of a man who has won a battle that has stopped meaning anything. And Third Army's casualty accounting for the entire period from the activation on the 1st of August through the end of November of 1944 presents two distinct military campaigns that happen to share a name. From August through early September, low casualties, high operational returns, the most effective exploitation campaign in the Western theater. From mid-September through November, high casualties, the Metz siege, Fort Driant, the cost of attrition warfare conducted without the mobility that had made Third Army exceptional. The transition between these two campaigns was made by a fuel decision taken above Patton's level in favor of a plan called Market Garden that failed to achieve its objectives at Arnhem in late September. Third Army paid for Market Garden's ambition. Bell noted it professionally in 7 words, in a section marked Remarks. It remains one of the most important sentences in the Third Army archive. Chapter 12, The Bulge, Rescue at Bastogne, the 19th of December, 1944, 10:32 in the morning. The Third Army operations log records the following entry. CG directed G3 to prepare 3 contingency plans for attack northward, to be ready for presentation no later than 1600 hours. 3 days earlier, the German 6th Panzer Army and 5th Panzer Army had struck the American 8th Corps in the Ardennes forest, opening the largest German offensive operation on the Western Front since D-Day. The formal conference at which Eisenhower would order Patton to attack northward was scheduled for that afternoon in Verdun. It had not yet occurred. The order had not been given. At 10:32 in the morning, 4 hours before he was formally ordered to act, Patton was already preparing the plans. He was not anticipating an order. He had been watching the situation for 3 days and had already decided what the order should be. The log entry is one of the most revealing documents in the entire Third Army archive. a commander preparing his own orders before the command authority to issue them had been formally delegated. The Verdun Conference on the afternoon of the 19th of December is one of those historical moments that has been described so many times, with such accumulating layers of legend, that the primary documents need to be read carefully to separate what actually happened from what the moment eventually became. Eisenhower had called together his senior commanders to address the German breakthrough, and the question of the meeting was what to do about Bastogne, the Belgian crossroads town where the 101st Airborne Division was in the process of being surrounded. When Eisenhower asked Patton how quickly he could attack north, Patton's answer was 48 hours. The room's reaction, documented in multiple accounts and in Bradley's diary, was somewhere between disbelief and concern that the general had lost contact with operational reality. An army doesn't pivot 90 degrees and attack in a new direction in 48 hours. Except that Patton had already alerted 3 divisions that morning. The statement was not bravado. It was a status report on work already in progress. The Third Army's pivot from an eastward to a northward axis required the physical reorientation of 133,178 vehicles over 72 hours in winter conditions, across a road network that Schaff's logistics staff had assessed as capable of supporting 1 corps, not 3. The fuel consumed in repositioning alone, before the first attack step was taken, was approximately 2,200,000 gallons. Muller had it. He always had it, which is the thing about Muller. He was always planning further ahead than the situation formally required. The Third Army's pivot at the Bulge is remembered as Patton's strategic vision and operational boldness, both of which it genuinely was. What it also was is the product of a logistics officer who had pre-positioned fuel for a contingency that hadn't been ordered yet, in a formation that was supposed to be attacking east, maintained against the resistance of a theater logistics system that didn't understand why an army that was already fighting needed fuel reserves for a battle it wasn't fighting. The 4th Armored Division's advance north from the Saar region toward Bastogne, beginning on the 22nd of December, is documented in Hugh Gaffey's after-action report with a precision that his more famous commanders' accounts notably lack. Gaffey, commanding the 4th Armored, describes the terrain as not a road in any engineering sense, a track through frozen Ardennes forest that the divisional engineers had assessed as marginal for wheeled vehicles and inadvisable for tracked ones in winter conditions. He passed armor through it anyway, at night, in temperatures approximately 8 degrees below freezing, because the alternative was waiting for better terrain, and the garrison at Bastogne didn't have the luxury of waiting for better terrain. 2 attack axes failed before Gaffey committed Combat Command Reserve to the Assinois route, the decision that broke through. His after-action report is unambiguous that this was his decision, made on his authority as division commander based on the failure of the first 2 attempts. It is also the decision that Patton's diary credits to Patton. Both accounts exist. The documentation supports Gaffey. The marching fire technique used by the tank infantry team that punched through the German encirclement at Assinois on the 26th of December, tanks advancing at maximum speed in column, firing forward into both flanks continuously, while infantry rode the rear decks until they jumped off to clear strong points, was a tactical drill that Patton had personally developed and documented in training memoranda written at the Desert Training Center in California in 1942. The specific procedures, the column spacing, the rules of engagement for the tank guns, the jump-off protocol for the riding infantry, were in a training circular that had been distributed to armored formations across the Army 2 years before Bastogne. The soldiers who broke through to the 101st Airborne on the evening of the 26th of December were executing a drill their commander had invented before any of them had fired a shot in anger. The doctrine arrived before the need, which is another way of saying that Patton had been right about some important things long before the war gave him the opportunity to prove it. The official time of link-up at Bastogne is recorded as 1650 hours on the 26th of December, 1944. It appears that way in the 101st Airborne's War Diary. It appears that way in the 4th Armored's War Diary. The two documents were written independently by men in different locations with different reporting chains and no immediate communication with each other, and they agree to the minute. 4 minutes of difference between two independent primary sources recording the same event. This is, in the practice of military history, an unusually precise convergence. Most historians treat it as confirmation. I treat it as an example of what the archive looks like when it's working correctly. When the documentation is dense enough and diverse enough that the truth can be triangulated from multiple independent positions. The German strategic position in the Ardennes by late December was one of profound overextension. And this is the context that both the popular mythology and the critical literature tend to underweight in accounts of the Bastogne relief. The 5th Panzer Army, encircling Bastogne, was simultaneously being pressed on its eastern flank by elements of 12th Corps, who were attacking south of the Bulge in a supporting operation that rarely receives the attention given to the northward drive. The German formations encircling the 101st could not be reinforced adequately, because the German command was fighting a battle on 3 simultaneous fronts within the Ardennes, north, south, and the center, where the thrust toward the Meuse was still nominally ongoing. Bastogne held partly because Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe's garrison was formidable. It held also because the German army encircling it was being bled by forces it couldn't fully account for. The relief was heroic. It was also assisted by the enemy's impossible overextension, and the archive is honest about this in a way that the legend is not. The 101st Airborne supply situation inside the Bastogne perimeter during the week before relief is documented in the Divisional G4 Logistics Report with a specificity that makes vivid reading. On the 23rd of December, available artillery ammunition was estimated at a 1-day supply. Anti-tank ammunition was critically low. Medical supplies had been partially resupplied by an aerial drop on the 23rd. The weather had cleared enough for C-47 transports to make the run, but the garrison was operating on the kind of improvisation that works until it doesn't. The medical officer's report notes that the field hospital was treating serious casualties with reduced anesthesia and limited surgical supplies. But the human cost of holding was being counted in specific shortages on specific shelves in a specific building in Bastogne, and the number on each shelf was declining by the day. When I was reviewing Patton's diary entries for the week surrounding the Bastogne relief, and I have read them multiple times across several years, what strikes me most is a peculiar quality in the writing that the published transcriptions tend to smooth out. Patton writes about the advance of 4th Armored with a level of operational detail that suggests he is not narrating from memory at the end of each day, but updating the diary in shorter intervals, sometimes multiple times in a single entry. And the December 26th entry in particular has a quality of breathlessness that his diary rarely permits itself, the updates accumulating through the afternoon as reports came in from Gaffey's command post, each entry adding detail to the previous one. By the entry timed at approximately 1800 hours, 2 hours after the link-up, he allows himself something close to relief. Not triumph. Relief. The tone of a man who had been calculating odds for 5 days and had just received confirmation that the calculation was going to come out. The operational cost of the Bastogne relief, 3rd Army's battle casualties from the 19th of December through the 31st, covering both the pivot and the northward advance, was approximately 12,000 men killed, wounded, or missing. Against this, and measured in the cold algebra of operational accounting, the prevention of a potential collapse of the American line at Bastogne, and the stabilization of the Ardennes front, military historians who specialize in the period generally agree that the loss of Bastogne would have compromised the entire southern shoulder of the Allied line in a way that might have required weeks to repair. Whether that repair would ultimately have been possible is a calculation that exists only in the conditional tense, which is where a certain kind of important historical question always lives, unanswerable and therefore permanent. Chapter 13. Across the Rhine. The night Patton waded in, the 21st of March, 1945. The Third Army G2 Intelligence Daily Summary contains a paragraph near the bottom of the second page that describes German defensive dispositions along the Rhine River between Mainz and Worms. It is standard analytical prose, the kind produced in hundreds of similar documents across dozens of headquarters every day of the war, measured, qualified, hedged appropriately against the limits of available information. The last sentence reads, Sector Oppenheim-Nierstein, assessed as lightly held, estimated 1 battalion equivalent with limited anti-armor capability. 36 words. The paragraph has no heading, no special notation, nothing to distinguish it from the surrounding text. Somewhere in the Third Army Operations section, someone read that sentence. Now cross-referenced it against aerial reconnaissance photographs and prisoner interrogation reports, and understood what it meant. The door was open. It had been left open not by incompetence, but by the logic of a German army defending 500 kilometers of riverbank, with formations so depleted they couldn't cover every crossing site at strength. The door was open, and the question was whether anyone would walk through it before it closed. The Rhine crossing at Oppenheim, on the night of the 22nd-23rd of March, 1945, has been described in most popular accounts as an act of brilliant audacity, Patton seizing an opportunity that more cautious commanders would have studied for another week. That description is not wrong. But it omits the intelligent substrate that made the audacity operationally rational rather than merely reckless. The G2 paragraph was written by professionals working from 3 independent sources. Aerial photography, taken on the 19th and 20th of March, showing no significant vehicle movement in the Oppenheim sector. Prisoner interrogation reports from captured elements of the German First Army, suggesting the sector was held by a single depleted battalion of fortress infantry with no armored support, and signals intelligence indicating no artillery registration activity at likely crossing points. The 36-word assessment was the product of layered analysis that had been running for 6 days before Patton saw it. The boldness was in acting on it within 24 hours. The intelligence work that made the action viable had been running quietly in the background for nearly a week. Lieutenant Colonel Hal Patterson, commanding the 2nd Infantry Regiment of the 5th Infantry Division, led the first assault crossing at Oppenheim at approximately 2200 hours on the 22nd of March. His after-action report describes the crossing in the dry, numbered language of professional infantry documentation, but certain details emerge from the prose that give it its character. The M2 assault boats used were plywood and canvas craft, powered by 55 horsepower outboard motors, capable of carrying 12 combat-loaded soldiers across open water at approximately 5 knots. The Rhine at Oppenheim was running at a current of approximately 3 knots on that night, which meant the effective crossing speed was roughly 2 knots, barely faster than a strong swimmer. 6 boats crossed simultaneously in the first wave, using the wave technique that specifically addressed the tactical risk of a defender engaging boats individually as they arrived in sequence. There was no defender engaging them. The opposite bank was, as the G2 had assessed, almost empty. Patterson's after-action report records that his first wave reached the far bank and established a perimeter in the absence of any organized resistance. Negligible is the word he used. He used it without irony. It was the intelligence section's word made operational reality. The call Patton made to Bradley from the East Bank on the 23rd of March is one of the most quoted exchanges of the entire campaign. And Bradley's diary records it with an exactness that suggests he understood immediately it was a conversation worth preserving. Patton says, in Bradley's account, "Brad, don't tell anyone, but I'm across." Then, after a pause, "I want the world to know Third Army made it before Monty." The 2 sentences are in perfect tension with each other. Don't tell anyone. I want the world to know. The contradiction is the message. He was not actually asking for secrecy. He was establishing the sequence. Bradley would hear it first, then it would be announced, and the announcement would have Bradley's implicit confirmation behind it. It was, in miniature, the same instinct that had kept the pressed uniform in the waterproof bag at Casablanca. He was managing the historical record while standing on a pontoon bridge in the dark over the Rhine. And the pontoon bridge that followed the infantry crossing was built by the 1138th Engineer Combat Group, and their after-action report is one of the most technically detailed documents in the Third Army Archive. A Class 40 bridge, capable of bearing 40-ton loads, sufficient for M4 Sherman tanks, was completed 7 hours after the 1st Infantry crossed. The bridge required 63 pontoon bays, emplaced in the dark, in river water, averaging 6 degrees Celsius, with intermittent German artillery fire falling in the vicinity throughout the construction period. The engineering manual standard for this type of bridge under ideal conditions was approximately 4 hours. The 1138th completed it in 7, which is not a failure to meet the standard, but a reflection of the conditions. The dark, the current, the artillery, the cold, that the manual's ideal conditions notation specifically excluded. The bridge was built by men whose names do not appear in any popular account of the Rhine crossing. The signal corps was upstream, covering the general's arrival. The arrival itself is in the historical record in 2 versions, and the gap between them is instructive. Patton's personal account makes no mention of preparation or staging. He crossed the Rhine. He stopped midway. He urinated into the river, in a deliberate echo of a similar gesture at the Siegfried Line 2 months earlier. He continued across. The account presents the moment as spontaneous, a soldier's instinct to mark a crossing. His aide, Lieutenant Alexander Stiller, gave an interview in 1970 that describes Patton asking for a minute before stepping onto the bridge, positioning himself relative to the camera team and then walking forward. The signal corps footage exists, the angle of the shot, the quality of the light, the placement of the camera relative to Patton's position on the bridge. These are not the characteristics of unstaged documentary footage. They are the characteristics of a brief production. He had been doing this since Casablanca. He would do it until he ran out of rivers. To me, the most revealing document from the Oppenheim crossing isn't the signal corps footage or Patton's diary or even Patterson's precise after-action report. It's the engineer after-action report on the bridge construction. 63 pontoon bays, 6 degrees Celsius, 7 hours, all intermittent artillery. That report is a document about what it actually costs to cross a river, in the currency of cold and labor, and interrupted sleep, and the specific calibrated fear of a man lying on a pontoon in the dark while shells land 200 meters upstream. The bridge enabled the crossing. The crossing enabled the advance into the German interior. The advance helped end the war. The engineers who built the bridge between 2300 hours on the 22nd of March and 0600 on the 23rd are the logical first cause in that chain of consequences, and they received no coverage equivalent to what was given to the man who stopped to urinate on the way across. The strategic consequence of Oppenheim for the overall Allied situation in late March of 1945 is the quiet revelation the archive contains and the popular narrative tends to miss. Montgomery's Operation Plunder, the set-piece Rhine crossing at Wesel on the night of the 23rd of March, was the most elaborately prepared river crossing operation in the history of the British Army. 31 divisions, 3,500 artillery pieces, a full airborne assault, Operation Varsity, involving more than 16,000 paratroopers in the air simultaneously. The planning had taken months. The preparation had consumed enormous logistical resources, and when it launched, it crossed a Rhine from which the German 1st Parachute Army had been partially stripped to respond to Third Army's crossing the night before, and Patton's improvised crossing in the lightly defended sector at Oppenheim directly facilitated the most elaborately planned crossing of the war by drawing German reserves south. Montgomery never acknowledged it. The operational record is unambiguous. The German First Army's response to the Oppenheim crossing is documented in translated excerpts of their operations log, now held at the National Archives. The entries for the 23rd and 24th of March describe a command attempting to respond to a crossing that had already established a bridgehead before the response could be organized. The available reserves were committed piecemeal, a battalion here, a company there, in the pattern of a force reacting faster than it can think. This pattern, which Patton had been deliberately creating since August of the previous year, now was by March of 1945 almost reflexive. Third Army moved at a speed that forced the German army into sequential rather than simultaneous responses, and sequential responses against a mobile force are inherently losing responses because each one is addressed at a position the force has already left. What the Rhine crossing closes, and what the advance into Germany opens, is the final question of Patton's operational career, not whether he could fight, which had been answered many times over by now, but what he was fighting toward. The military objectives were clear: advance, destroy German forces in place, reach the army boundaries, wait for further orders. But in Patton's diary entries from late March and April, a different kind of objective appears with increasing frequency: the Soviet Union, the post-war settlement, the shape of the world after Germany surrendered. He was thinking about what came after the war in the same terms he thought about operational planning, as a problem with a solution, a problem that required speed and audacity and the willingness to advance past the point where more cautious men would stop. The Rhine crossing was behind him. Prague was ahead. The distance between them was measured not just in kilometers, but in everything that American and Allied political authority was or wasn't prepared to do. Chapter 14. The Eagle and the Camps. The 4th of April, 1945. Elements of the 4th Armored Division, advancing through the Thuringian countryside in the pattern of fast probing movement that had characterized Third Army's operations since August, which came over a rise in the ground approximately 5 kilometers south of the town of Ohrdruf and encountered something that stopped the advance. Not German resistance, not terrain, something else. The Third Army, G5 Civil Affairs. Report number 7, dated the 12th of April, describes what they found in the language of official documentation: approximately 3,200 deceased male prisoners, and evidence of systematic execution. And the clinical distance of that language is doing a specific kind of work. It is containing something that the human mind, confronting the actual site, could not contain. Several soldiers' letters home from the first week of April, held in the Veterans History Project archive, let me describe what they saw at Ohrdruf, in terms that abandon the effort to be precise and settle for the effort to convey scale. You wouldn't believe it, the letters say again. But this time, the phrase means something different than it meant in the liberated French villages of August. This time it means, I saw something I cannot explain to you, and the gap between what I saw and what I can say is permanent. Patton visited Ohrdruf on the 12th of April, along with Eisenhower and Bradley. This is documented in the G5 report, which records CG, 3rd Army, visited site, 12 April 1945, and in Eisenhower's own diary, and in Signal Corps photographs that show all 3 generals walking through the camp, with the specific expression that photographs from these visits share: a kind of locked stillness of the face that is not composure, but its opposite. Patton's diary entry for the 12th of April is one of the most quoted passages in his collected papers. He describes what he saw. He describes his physical reaction, and he does not hide it, which is notable in a document he was always conscious of as a historical record. He was sick. He was physically sick at what he saw. The man who had spent 3 years manufacturing a persona of iron certainty, who had pressed his uniform before landing at Casablanca, who had staged his photograph on the Rhine bridge. That man was sick in a field in Thuringia and wrote it down without editing. All 2 pages after the site visit notation in the G5 Civil Affairs, report number 7, there is a second entry. It records that Patton ordered the mayor of Gotha to bring 1,000 German civilians to tour the camp at Ohrdruf. The mayor complied. He organized the tour. He walked through the camp with his fellow citizens. He returned home. He hanged himself that evening. The G5 report records this without commentary, in the same register as the rest of the document. The report was written by a staff officer doing his job, and his job did not require him to editorialize. But the proximity of the 2 entries, the order to bring civilians, the death of the mayor, creates a meaning that the neutral language cannot suppress. The order to bring German civilians to the camps was not limited to Gotha. OG5 records across the Third Army area of operations show that the policy was implemented throughout April and May of 1945. By the end of the occupation period, more than 35,000 German civilians had been ordered to tour liberated camps in the Third Army area. The psychological and moral effect of this policy on the German civilian population, its potential contribution to the post-war acknowledgement of what had happened, has been almost entirely unstudied by historians. The policy sits in the administrative records, documented and real, and its long-term consequences exist somewhere in the unmeasurable territory between history and psychology. What it tells us about Patton is that in the weeks after Ohrdruf, something shifted in his understanding of what the war had been about. And he had always understood war as a competitive military problem. The camps forced a reckoning with what the competitive military problem had been wrapped around. The moral complexity of Patton's response to the camps is located in a tension that the archive documents with uncomfortable precision and that biographers have handled with varying degrees of honesty. His diary entries in the weeks following Ohrdruf are anguished and genuine. There is no performance in them, no consciousness of posterity. They are the entries of a man confronting something his worldview hadn't prepared him for. And in the same period, the same diary contains statements about Jewish displaced persons in the camps he was administering that are anti-Semitic in their characterization and demeaning in their framing. Both things are documented. Both things are true simultaneously. Historian Carlo D'Este, whose 1995 biography is the most balanced of the major Patton biographies, presents these entries in full context and situates them within what he describes as the prejudices of Patton's class and generation. Historian Deborah Lipstadt argues that typical of his generation is a description, not an exculpation, and that Patton's administrative decisions regarding displaced persons camps reflected these prejudices in ways that materially affected the lives of survivors. Both scholars are working from the same documents. Their conclusions differ because their moral frameworks differ. The archive cannot resolve this disagreement. It can only hold both sides of it. Eisenhower's response to the camps was, in its own way, as revealing as Patton's. His order to document everything, every body, every building, every record, every structure, every piece of evidence of what had happened, was issued within days of his first camp visit. The order's language, preserved in the Schaff records, contains a sentence that is lodged in the memory of every historian who has read it. He wanted the evidence preserved, he wrote, for a day when someone would deny it. He was standing in a liberated concentration camp in April of 1945, and he was already anticipating denial. The foresight in that sentence is almost unbearable. The Signal Corps, the combat camera units, the documentary teams dispatched to every camp in the Allied area. All of it was driven by Eisenhower's understanding that the truth, in this case, would require a bureaucratic infrastructure to survive. It was required. The evidence exists. The denial came anyway. The scale of what Third Army's area of operations contained is a number that the administrative record states flatly, and the imagination resists absorbing. 18 concentration and labor camps of various types within the Third Army's operational boundaries by April of 1945. Approximately 160,000 survivors requiring immediate relief. 147 civil affairs officers in the G5 section responsible for administering that relief, alongside the governance of millions of German civilians and the processing of hundreds of thousands of prisoners of war. The ratio of administrative resource to human need was not a ratio, it was a gap. The men and women who worked in the civil affairs section during April and May of 1945 were doing something that had no professional precedent, no training doctrine, no manual. They were improvising the relief of a catastrophe at a scale that the planning architecture of military administration had never been asked to address. Their reports are in the National Archives. They are written in the standard format. The standard format barely contains what they're describing. When I was reading through the G5 reports from April and May of 1945, I found myself returning repeatedly to Rabbi Herschel Schachter's testimony, not in the G5 reports themselves, which are administrative documents, but in the multiple accounts he gave over subsequent decades about his experience as the U.S. An army chaplain at Buchenwald. Schachter arrived at Buchenwald on the 11th of April, one day after its liberation. He describes, in testimony given at various points between the 1960s and the 2000s, walking through the camp and finding survivors who did not believe he was real, who had been in the camp long enough that the arrival of an American Jewish chaplain speaking Yiddish was not immediately processable as fact. He spoke to them in Yiddish. He told them the war was almost over. He told them they were free. Several of them, he said, did not know what the word meant in the context he was using it. They had been in the camps long enough that freedom had become an abstraction. Schachter's testimony is morally precise in a way that official military documentation, by its nature, cannot be. He was describing the distance between liberation and freedom, the gap between the moment the gates open and the moment the person inside understands what the open gates mean. The question the camps pose to any honest account of Patton's war is one that cannot be answered within the military historical frame and must be asked outside it. The operational accomplishments, the miles advanced, the prisoners taken, the battles won, the armies rebuilt and redirected, can be weighed and assessed and compared within their own category. But the camps are outside that category. They are the reason the category existed. The war that Patton fought, and fought brilliantly at the operational level, was fought in the service of ending a regime that had built those camps. Error and the full reckoning with that fact requires more than operational history can provide. What the archive gives us is this: a general who was sick at Ohrdruf, who was genuinely undone by what he saw, and who in the same weeks wrote things about the survivors that diminish him permanently. Both things are in the same handwriting, in the same diary. The archive holds both. It will not choose between them. Chapter 15, The Race to Prague, the war that almost was the 30th of April, 1945. The Schaff message log records a communication from Patton to Eisenhower, marked personal, which reads in part, "I can be in Prague in 96 hours. Request authority." The message has a routing annotation in a second hand. Seen by COFS, referred to CG. Below that annotation, in a third hand, is a single word, denied. The word is not initialed. The person who wrote it did not put their name to it. Whatever they understood about the weight of that word, what it would mean for Prague, for Czechoslovakia, for the 44 years that followed, they chose not to own it in the archive. The denial sits without a signature, which is its own kind of historical fact. Third Army's operational position on the 1st of May, 1945, is documented in the Daily Situation Report with the same precision that all Third Army situation reports maintained. Forward elements were located at Cheb, in the Sudetenland, approximately 190 kilometers from Prague, but are at Third Army's average rate of advance in the final weeks of the war, approximately 50 kilometers per day against negligible opposition. Patton's 96-hour estimate was accurate. It was not bravado. It was arithmetic applied to a road network and an order of battle. The Soviet First Ukrainian Front, approaching Prague from the east, was positioned approximately 80 kilometers from the city on the same date. Third Army would have arrived first by a margin of approximately 24 hours, assuming both formations maintained their rates of advance. The race that didn't happen can be mapped in kilometers and timed in hours, and the mathematics of it are not ambiguous. Eisenhower's rationale for denying Patton's request is preserved in his correspondence with General George Marshall, Chief of Staff, in the Eisenhower Papers, where the argument has two components, both documented. The first was military. The risk of an armed confrontation between American and Soviet forces converging on Prague from different axes, in conditions of fluid movement and imperfect communications, was real and serious. Forces that cannot reliably communicate are forces that can shoot at each other, and a firefight between American and Soviet soldiers in May of 1945 would have been a catastrophe of a different kind than anything the war had yet produced. The second was political. The post-war occupation zones in Europe had been established by the European Advisory Commission in 1944, and Prague fell within the Soviet zone. and moving American forces into Soviet-designated territory was a violation of agreements that had been negotiated at the highest levels of Allied government. Eisenhower was not making an independent military judgment. He was implementing a political decision made above his level. That distinction matters, and the archive makes it clear. What the archive also makes clear, and this is the element that historians working from the American and British records alone have sometimes understated, is that the Soviet command response to Patton's position near Prague was itself a matter of urgency and deliberate decision. Sections of the Soviet military records from this period, accessible at the Russian State Military Archive in Moscow, and available in translated excerpts in several Western academic publications. They show that Marshal Konev's First Ukrainian Front was ordered to advance on Prague with maximum urgency, specifically in response to the American position at Cheb. The Soviets knew where Third Army was. They knew what Patton had asked for. They were racing too, against a threat they understood clearly. The political denial that stopped Patton was issued in awareness of Soviet diplomatic pressure, and the Soviet military advance on Prague was accelerated in awareness of American military capability. This is a Cold War dynamic operating inside the last days of the Second World War, and its presence in the documents of both sides makes the Prague decision a more complex and less easily moralizable event than Patton's diary, or most popular histories, presents it as. A. Patton's diary entry for the 30th of April contains a sentence that is one of the most genuinely prescient things he ever wrote, and which has been quoted so frequently in subsequent decades that it has become detached from its documentary context. "The Soviet bear," he wrote, "will be impossible to hold back once he has entered the room." He was not making a geopolitical prediction in any formal sense. He was expressing, in the unguarded language of a private journal, an operational instinct that positions, once established by military force, define the subsequent political terrain. He understood, from long experience with the relationship between military position and political outcome, that the map of post-war Europe would be drawn in the same ink as the final military situation map. He was right. The final military situation map placed Soviet forces in Prague. The post-war map placed Prague behind the Iron Curtain for 44 years. The connection is not coincidental. The Prague uprising of the 5th through 8th of May, 1945, when Czech civilians rose against the German garrison in the days before the formal German surrender, is documented in Czech historical sources that most Anglophone histories of the campaign treat as marginal. Czech partisans and ordinary civilians fought German SS units in the streets of Prague, while American forces were approximately 80 kilometers away, stopped by the line that Schaff had drawn. The Red Army entered on the 9th of May. That several thousand Czech civilians and fighters died in the uprising between the 5th and the 9th. The exact number remains disputed in Czech historiography, with estimates ranging from 2,000 to more than 3,000. These deaths occurred in the space between the American position and the city. They occurred in the gap that the word denied had created. The document without an initial the archive holds is connected to those deaths by a chain of decision and consequence that runs through Eisenhower's desk and above it, through the European Advisory Commission's 1944 deliberations, through the political agreements of the Grand Alliance, to the specific moment when someone who didn't want to own the decision wrote a single word in the margin of a routing slip. The Czech government in exile in London had communicated its preference directly to Schaeff in early April. The message is in the Schaeff archives at the National Archives in College Park, Maryland. It requested that American forces liberate Prague. It was received. It was acknowledged. It was not acted upon. I find that document, the request, the acknowledgement, the silence that followed, one of the most morally difficult things in the entire archive. Not because the decision was necessarily wrong, the case for Eisenhower's position is real and serious and documented, but because the process made visible something that military political decisions always contain and rarely acknowledge. The people whose lives depend on the outcome of the decision are almost never present when the decision is made. The Czech civilians who would live under Soviet occupation for 44 years were not in the room at Schaeff when the denial was written. They sent a message. The message is in the archive. The archive holds it alongside the word that answered it. When I was working through the Schief message traffic for late April and early May of 1945, cross-referencing the Prague communications against the operational situation reports for Third Army, something about the administrative density of the final days of the European War struck me with particular force. The volume of messages, orders, situation reports, and command communications in the Schief system was at its highest point of the entire campaign in the final 2 weeks of the war. Not because the fighting was heaviest, but because the transition from war to occupation required a simultaneous administrative dismantling of the military command structure and the construction of the military government structure that would replace it. In the middle of this administrative cascade, in a message log handling hundreds of communications per day, the most geopolitically significant decision of the final campaign was a single word, uninitialed in a margin. The scale of the bureaucratic context that surrounded that word makes it more rather than less significant. It was easy to write. It was written in the middle of other things, and it shaped the lives of 17 million Czechoslovak citizens for 2 generations. Patton's VE Day diary entry, recorded on the 8th of May 1945, is 4 words after the opening statement of fact. The war is over, and I am not pleased. The phrase has been read as characteristic Patton, the restless warrior unable to accept peace, and that reading is not wrong, but read in the context of the Prague denial, the preceding weeks of forced inactivity at the political boundary, and the operational position of Third Army in the final days, the 4 words carry additional weight. He was not displeased that the war was over. He was displeased at what the war's ending looked like from where he was standing, stopped at a line drawn by people who weren't there, watching a city he could have reached in 4 days go to an ally he didn't trust, with the knowledge, expressed in his diary, in his letters, in his conversations with Codman, that the line on the map was not the end of the conflict, but the beginning of a different one. Or Chapter 16, Governor of Bavaria, the final unraveling, the 22nd of August, 1945, Third Army Military Government Report, number 14, a table on the 3rd page headed Denazification Compliance Assessment. 1 column, American Zone, 3rd Army Area. Adjacent column, British Zone, Comparable Territorial Coverage. The 3rd Army figure for former Nazi Party members dismissed from local administrative positions in the reporting period, 614. The British figure, 4,200. The disparity is in the report, in the table, in numbers that sit next to each other without annotation or explanation. No staff officer needed to write a commentary. The numbers were the commentary, and they were legible to anyone who read them with professional attention. They were read. Nothing changed. The administrative logic behind Patton's denazification policy in Bavaria is documented in his letters and in the records of military government meetings held during the summer of 1945. The argument he made, consistently, and with the kind of force he brought to all arguments he believed, was essentially pragmatic. Bavaria needed to be administered, and the only people in Bavaria with administrative experience and institutional knowledge were, overwhelmingly, former members of the Nazi Party. The Nazi Party had been the governing institution of Germany for 12 years. Competent administrators had been Nazi Party members the way competent administrators in any functioning state are members of the governing political structure. To remove all of them simultaneously was, Patton argued, to create an administrative vacuum that would produce famine, civil disorder, disease, and the collapse of the infrastructure upon which the occupation itself depended. The argument is coherent, applied with the discrimination it required, distinguishing between opportunistic party membership and actual criminality, between a bureaucrat who had joined to keep his job and an officer who had run a forced labor program. It might even have been a workable approach to a genuinely difficult problem. The problem was that Patton did not apply it with discrimination. Joseph Rastatter, a German anti-Nazi who worked with American military government in Bavaria during the occupation period, his memoirs were published in German in 1971 and partially translated in a 1994 academic paper on American occupation policy. describes watching known collaborators and active participants in Nazi governance reinstated to administrative positions alongside ordinary party members who had no criminal record. The distinction that Patton's pragmatic argument required him to maintain between party membership and war crimes was not being maintained in practice. Rastatter describes specific cases where the identity of the individuals being reinstated was known to members of the local community, who had no mechanism for raising objections to American military government that would be heard. The documentary record in the G5 Civil Affairs files for Bavaria contains complaints from local anti-Nazi Germans that went unanswered. The administrative pragmatism that Patton was defending in the policy meeting rooms was, at the ground level of its implementation, something uglier. The press conference on the 22nd of September, 1945, is the document that ended Patton's tenure as military governor of Bavaria, and it is one of those historical moments that is fully legible only if you read the transcript rather than relying on subsequent summaries. A reporter asked Patton about the denazification policy. Patton replied, in language that was recorded verbatim, that the Nazi Party was to Germans just like the Democratic and Republican parties were to Americans, a political organization that people joined for various reasons, not a criminal enterprise to be uniformly treated as such. The statement was broadcast. The reaction was immediate. Eisenhower received messages from Washington, from European capitals, from Jewish organizations, from members of Congress. The message from Marshall's office was understood as a deadline rather than a concern. Eisenhower relieved Patton of the Bavaria command within 48 hours of the press conference. The relief order itself is a document of characteristic Eisenhower craftsmanship, the kind of document that accomplishes its operational purpose while maintaining the maximum number of future options. Patton was assigned command of 15th Army, or described in the order as responsible for preparing historical studies of military operations in the European theater. The assignment sounded substantive. It was a room with books in it. 15th Army had no combat troops, no operational function, no purpose beyond the production of historical analyses that a general of Patton's temperament and capability was the last person the Army should have been assigning to write. He was 60 years old, and Eisenhower was giving him a library card. Both men understood this. Neither said it in any document that has survived. When I was reading through the military government records from Bavaria, the G5 reports, the denazification compliance tables, the complaints that went unanswered, the detail that keeps returning to me is from Rastatter's memoirs rather than from the American Administrative Archive. He describes attending a military government meeting at which Patton was present. One of the command-level meetings where the denazification policy was being discussed, and observing that Patton's engagement with the question of individual criminal culpability was almost nil. He wasn't interested in the cases. He was interested in the administrative outcome. The question of whether a specific reinstated official had personally participated in a specific atrocity was, to Patton, a legal and judicial question to be handled by other agencies. His job was to run Bavaria. Running Bavaria required administrators. The moral accounting could happen elsewhere. Jai Rastatter writes that he found this compartmentalization extraordinary in a man who had personally toured Ohrdruf and been visibly undone by it. The same general who had been sick in the field at Ohrdruf was, 6 months later, reinstating former Nazi officials on pragmatic administrative grounds. The two responses were not, in Patton's psychology, contradictory. That is precisely what makes them historically significant. The operational record of Third Army's combat performance and the administrative record of its military government performance represent two chapters of the same institutional story, and the discontinuity between them is one of the most instructive patterns in the archive. The qualities that made Patton exceptional as a combat commander, the velocity of decision, the intolerance for nuance that slowed movement, and the conversion of complex situations into simple binary problems of advance or retreat were exactly the qualities that made him a poor military governor. Governing an occupied country in the aftermath of a totalitarian regime requires precisely the opposite skill set: patience for ambiguity. capacity for moral discrimination, willingness to sit with complexity that doesn't resolve into an order of march. Patton didn't have these qualities. He had never needed them. The war had not required them. The occupation did, and the gap between the requirement and the man was too wide to be papered over by energy and force of personality. Patton's tenure at 15th Army lasted 11 weeks. The historical studies he was assigned to produce were not completed. His diary entries from October and November of 1945 have a quality that distinguishes them from every other period of his diary. They are short, and they are present tense in a way that the earlier entries, with their operational planning and forward projection, never were. He was no longer projecting forward. He was describing the immediate days, the horses he was riding, the books he was reading, a rereading of Arthurian material that he had returned to throughout his life. His conversations with Codman, who was still there, still writing letters, still the most reliable lens through which the private Patton is visible in the archive. The image that emerges from the final weeks is of a man who had run a very long race and had now stopped and was finding that stopping was more difficult than running had been. Yes, the military government chapter of Patton's career closes with the denazification compliance table, 614 dismissals against 4,200 in the British zone, sitting in an archive where it has always been available to anyone who looked for it, making the same silent argument that Bell's 7-word Metz observation makes, that the official record, read carefully and with an eye for what the numbers say rather than what the narrative prefers, is frequently more honest than the narrative. The table doesn't condemn Patton. It describes him. The description is a form of historical judgment from which there is no appeal and no revision, just the 2 columns of numbers, side by side, in a military government compliance report that nobody ordered any action on. Chapter 17, The Accident, the Archive, and the Argument, the 9th of December, 1945, Route 38, near Mannheim, Germany, 11:45 in the morning. A standard Army traffic accident form records the event in the administrative language of military documentation: time, location, vehicle description, nature of collision. Struck by 2.5-ton truck entering road from left. In the box labeled Injuries, a clerk has typed P.W. Patton, General, USA, cervical fracture, paralysis. The form is 4 inches by 6 inches. The injury box is 3/4 of an inch tall. It does not look like a document about the end of something. It looks like what it is: a traffic accident form. The bureaucratic machinery of the United States Army processed the injury of its most celebrated commander in the same format it used for fender benders at motor pool entrances in rear area depots. The archive is indiscriminate in this way, which is one of its most important qualities. The accident itself, the collision between the Cadillac staff car carrying Patton and a 2.5-ton Army truck that turned into the road without adequate observation, has been the subject of a persistent conspiracy theory claiming deliberate assassination. The theory takes various forms depending on the source, but its essential claim is that either OSS operatives or Soviet intelligence arranged the accident to prevent Patton from returning to America and advocating publicly against the post-war settlement with the Soviet Union. The claim has been made in books, documentaries, and documentary films, with varying degrees of seriousness. Evaluating it requires nothing more elaborate than reading the primary documents carefully. T5. Robert Thompson, the driver of the truck, gave a consistent account of the accident in 3 separate interviews over the subsequent months. Consistent in the details that witnesses who are remembering accurately are consistent in, and variable in, the minor peripheral details that witnesses who are truthfully describing something are variable in. The accident is documented in independent German civilian witness accounts that corroborate the American military record. There is no gap in the documentation, no anomalous detail, no evidentiary thread that leads anywhere other than an intersection on Route 38, where a truck driver looked left instead of right at the wrong moment. The conspiracy theory exists because the alternative, that one of the war's defining figures died in a minor road accident caused by ordinary human inattention, is narratively unsatisfying. History is frequently narratively unsatisfying. This does not make it wrong. Patton was paralyzed from the shoulders down by the cervical fracture. He was lucid throughout the 12 days between the accident and his death. His wife Beatrice flew from the United States and was with him at the 7th Army Hospital in Heidelberg. His letters from the hospital, dictated because he could no longer hold a pen, are in the Patton papers. They are the most purely personal documents in the collection. No operational planning, no self-fashioning, no consciousness of the historical record. He asked about horses. He asked about the farm in Massachusetts. He quoted Mallory. He wrote, dictated, to old friends about old campaigns and the specific quality of light at particular times of day, in particular places. The letters have the character of a man doing a kind of final accounting that has nothing to do with battle maps or after-action reports. He was locating himself in the things that had always been real to him underneath the performance. The 21st of December, 1945, 1745 hours. Patton died of pulmonary edema, fluid accumulation in the lungs, a complication of the paralysis and associated embolism. Yet the hospital log records the time. He was 60 years old. The same signal corps that had photographed him at Casablanca, at El Guettar, at Palermo, at Bastogne, at the Rhine, was not present in the hospital room. There were no cameras. There was no arrangement of subordinates. There was Beatrice, and there was the doctor, and there was the machinery of a military hospital in Germany in December of 1945, and then there was the hospital log, recording the time in the format it used for everything. Patton is buried at the Luxembourg American Cemetery at his own request, with the men of Third Army in the formation where he is simply one white marble headstone among 5,076 identical white marble headstones. The grave's dimensions are standard issue. The stone's inscription follows the cemetery's uniform format. He is not separated from his soldiers by any architectural gesture. The man who had spent his entire professional life making himself singular chose to be uniform in death, and the choice has been interpreted in various ways by various historians, as humility, as theater, as a last act of command presence among his men, as the sincere expression of a conviction that the soldiers mattered more than the general. All of these interpretations are available in the archive. The archive does not choose between them. Perhaps, after everything, it doesn't need to. The historiographical argument about Patton is not one argument. It is several, running simultaneously and intersecting at points that generate more heat than clarity. The argument about his operational genius is essentially settled in his favor at the formation level. Third Army's performance in August of 1944 is, by any serious military historical measure, the finest sustained exploitation campaign by an American formation in the European theater, and the architectural intelligence behind it, including the logistics management, the signal discipline, the combined arms techniques, represents a level of operational sophistication that his biographers have sometimes underweighted in favor of the theatrical details. The argument about his strategic judgment is not settled, and probably cannot be, because it turns on counterfactual questions. What would have happened at Falaise if the pocket had been closed? And what would the post-war map have looked like if Prague had been reached? That the available evidence can inform, but not resolve. The argument that is least settled, and that the archive most insistently reopens, is the moral argument. Patton's treatment of battle-fatigue patients, the slapping incidents and the policy beneath them, caused demonstrable harm to demonstrable individuals whose medical conditions are documented. His denazification policy in Bavaria produced a compliance rate that left former Nazi officials in administrative positions in ways that were inconsistent with his stated justification for the policy. His diary contains anti-Semitic characterizations of Jewish displaced persons written in the same weeks that he was administering camps, holding tens of thousands of Jewish survivors. These are not allegations, and they are documents. The documents are in archives that are open to the public. Carlo d'Este engaged with them, honestly. Ladislas Farrago largely did not. The most recent serious scholarship, including work by historians who are deeply respectful of Patton's operational achievement, does not look away from them. To me, the honest position after working through this archive is that the moral argument and the operational argument are genuinely separate and genuinely irresolvable from each other. Patton's operational achievement at the level of Corps and Army command is a matter of documented record. His personal conduct toward sick soldiers, toward displaced survivors, toward the administrative responsibilities of occupation, is also a matter of documented record. The two records do not cancel each other. They do not combine into a single verdict. They exist simultaneously in the same archive, in many cases in the same document. The same man who was sick at Ohrdruf, who wrote things about survivors that cannot be defended, who built an army that moved fast enough to save the soldiers in it, who manufactured his own image from the first landing to the last river, who paced his tent past midnight, while his aide wrote letters home about a general who was visibly anxious in ways he never permitted in public. The archive holds all of it. It will not resolve it. That is the correct function of an archive. The operational accounting at the close of the war, 747 days of active command, 1,300 miles of advance, 27,000 square miles of territory liberated, and 1,280,000 prisoners captured, 136,865 American battle casualties. The numbers are in the official histories. They carry within them a moral weight that the operational frame cannot fully accommodate. Every casualty figure is a person, and the people behind the figure had families, and the families received notifications, and the notifications are in shoeboxes and attic drawers across America, in languages that include English and Italian and Polish and Spanish and Yiddish, because the army that Patton commanded was more various than any army he had studied or imagined when he was writing about reincarnation and warrior souls in the years before the war. He commanded that army. The army was those people. Even the distance between the general and the soldiers was, depending on the moment, the distance between the commander and his instrument, or the distance between a man performing certainty and the people who needed certainty to be real enough to die for. The last thing the archive gives us is a request that went unanswered. The Czech government in exile asked for American forces to liberate Prague. The message was received, acknowledged, and filed. The word denied sits without an initial in a message log in College Park, Maryland. Prague was occupied by Soviet forces until the 19th of November, 1989, when the crowds in Wenceslas Square were large enough and loud enough that the government that had governed since 1948 finally understood that it was over. Yet the archive does not draw the line from the unsigned word in 1945 to the crowd in 1989. That is the historian's work, to draw the line, to measure its length, to consider what moved along it and what it cost. I've spent a long time with this archive. The line is real. Its length is 44 years. What it cost is beyond precise accounting, and what it teaches depends on what questions you bring to it. The archive will still be there when you're ready to look.